Yeah, there we go. Thank you very much. Good morning, muy buenos días. My name is Jose Carrion. I'm the chair of the board. And I would like to welcome all of you here today to this 11th meeting of our Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico. I would like all of you present here today to cooperate, please, with us in conducting a productive meeting and keeping cell phones in silent mode and abstaining from conversation and comments. I'd like to begin by conducting the roll call. Andrew Briggs. Mr. Carlos Garcia.
Present.
Judge Gonzalez.
Present.
Mrs. Mato Santos.
Present.
Professor Skeel. The ex officio member, Governor Rosello's representative, Mr. Christian Sobrino.
Here.
Quorum is present. It's a majority of the voting members of the board. Now I'd like to call the meeting to order. But before I do, just a moment, if we may, a brief moment of silence for the victims of Hurricane Maria and their families, please. Thank you. I would like to ask Mr. Jaime El Curi, the General Counsel of our board, to act as secretary for this meeting. I'd like to, if I may, recognize the presence of Mr. Jerry Portela, Executive Director of the Puerto Rico Fiscal Agency and Financial Advisory Authority. Welcome. Mr. Francisco Pares, Assistant Secretary for Internal Revenue and Tax Policy. Mr. Edwin Rios, Assistant Secretary for Economic and Financial Affairs. He is in representation of Mr. Raul Maldonado, the Secretary for the Department of Treasury for Puerto Rico. And I would like to thank all of you once again present in attendance at this 11th meeting of the board, and also everyone who is watching the live stream of the meeting via the board's website at www.oversightboard.pr.gov. I am pleased to say that the audio of this meeting via the webcast is also available in English and a simultaneous translation in Spanish. If you log on to the English website, the audio will be in English, and if you log into the Spanish website, you will hear the simultaneous translation. Now let us move forward and talk of the agendas before us this morning. The first agenda is the administrative matters before the board. Second point is presentation by the government on post-Maria recovery efforts. The third point is presentation of the government on federal tax reform efforts, followed by a presentation by Mr. Portela, the Executive Director of AFAF, on the liquidity status of the government of Puerto Rico and the budget expenditures to date, followed by a presentation and discussion on the importance of structural reforms in the updated fiscal plan, an update on the fiscal plan listening sessions, a presentation of the budget review process for fiscal year 2019, a presentation and approval of debt review policy, then a revision a discussion and revision to the code of conduct of the board, an update on the contract review and approval policy would be the last point. Finally, before we get started, I would like to express my appreciation to all who are working on behalf of Puerto Rico to get the island back on its feet following the worst natural disaster that have occurred in the Caribbean in recent history. We have significant work to do in the weeks and months ahead, and this work will be critical for supporting the island in realizing its long-term economic recovery. Before we start today's meeting, I'd like to take a moment to remind everyone that the work facing the board, the challenges we all faced together, are unprecedented. The most important factor for the island's economic recovery is the size and timing of federal aid. We will continue to advocate for Puerto Rico and Washington to get the disaster relief and recovery assistance that is needed following hurricane. Achieving PROMESA's goals will require tax reform legislation that does not adversely impact businesses operating on the island, and significant investment in recovery efforts to rebuild and transform the island's infrastructure, making it more efficient, more resilient, and more cost-effective. Achieving PROMESA's goals will require working with the government of Puerto Rico through our contract review policy and by incorporating the federal funds into the capital expenditure portion of the revised fiscal plans as they are appropriated. The board will continue to play its role in ensuring federal funds for disaster relief are used in the best interest of the island. Before PROMESA, Puerto Rico did not have the tools or the plan to break Puerto Rico's endless cycle of economic stagnation and fiscal debt and crises. With PROMESA, the island now has, for the first time, a viable path to economic recovery through fiscal balance and structural reform to improve the investment climate. To that end, the board will continue to collaborate with the government of Puerto Rico to promptly revise the fiscal plans to lay out a path in a post-hurricane Puerto Rico. Structural reforms will inspire business confidence and investment, the creation of jobs, improved productivity, and the strengthening of Puerto Rico's competitive advantages. Meanwhile, the fiscal reforms laid out in the original fiscal plans remain just as important today, and in some cases even more so. Reforming the tax code, healthcare reform, right-sizing, and implementing the best practices for budget and cash management controls are all critical for Puerto Rico to achieve fiscal responsibility and regain access to the capital markets. To build a stronger Puerto Rico, we must pursue fiscal reforms that encourage accountability, discipline, and transparency. Finally, the board will continue to work with creditors and debt holders to restructure Puerto Rico's debt fairly. However, until we have clarity on the size and timing of federal disaster relief, and we have the benefit of the revised fiscal plans, we cannot come to any conclusions about how to proceed with restructuring Puerto Rico's immense debt burden. Our work is more difficult now, but more important than ever. Every member of this board has redoubled their effort to deliver on our mandate. We want the hardworking people of Puerto Rico, our families, our friends, and our colleagues who make up the fabric of our great community to have a place to realize their futures. We want them to be able to live, work, and raise a family knowing that a foundation for economic stability and growth is being created for them. Thank you very much. Now let us move on to take the agenda for today's work. Our first order of business is to approve the minutes of the board's last meeting held on October 31st, 2017. The proposed minutes are included in the meeting materials, Appendix A. Does anybody have any questions about these minutes? There being no questions, I would like to ask for a motion to approve the minutes.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to move to approve the minutes.
Would anybody like to second that motion, please?
I second the motion.
Then I'd like to ask, please, for a voice vote. Those in favor, please say yes.
Yes.
Yes. All the members having voted in favor of the motion, the minutes are approved.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to make the following motion. Between the adjournment of this meeting and the opening of the board's next public meeting, the board may consider in executive session any and all matters that it is authorized to consider under PROMESA, including first, any certification determinations authorized by PROMESA, including certification determinations under Section 206 of PROMESA. Second, any submissions or authorizations authorized by PROMESA, and third, any filings authorized under Title III of PROMESA, in each case that are set forth as part of the vote to convene such executive session. The board may also act by unanimous written consent between meetings in accordance with bylaws, with such consent to include consent by email.
Mr. Chair, I second the motion.
Thank you. I'd like to ask for a voice vote. Those in favor, please say yes.
Yes.
Yes. All the members having voted in favor of the motion, the resolution is approved unanimously. I would like to ask now the governor's representative, Mr. Christian Sobrino, to read a statement on behalf of Secretary Hector Pesquera from the Department of Public Safety in Puerto Rico on the status of post-Maria recovery efforts on the island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to be reading into the record remarks from Hector Pesquera, Secretary of the Puerto Rico Department of Public Safety, and State Coordinating Officer for DR 4336, Hurricane Irma, and DR 4339, Hurricane Maria. Thank you for inviting me to present my comments and observations to the board related to the response phase of Hurricanes Irma and Maria, and some initial information about the recovery of Puerto Rico under the Governor's Central Recovery and Reconstruction Office. As you know, Puerto Rico has experienced a disaster that is not only unprecedented in our history, but one that is unprecedented anywhere in the United States. We were hit by two major hurricanes, hit within weeks of each other, something that has never happened before in U.S. history. Never before has 100% of a state or territory been devastated like that which has occurred here, with every man, woman, child, business, and government entity impacted. Never before has the disaster response period for a large or catastrophic event lasted as long as it has here in Puerto Rico, where even today, nearly 75 days later, we are still in response mode for portions of the island. It is unprecedented that an entire state population lost power, water, and basic services, with devastation so extreme that it could take months to fully restore them. Add to that the fact that Puerto Rico is an island, which means that none of the solutions to our challenges are easy, and the logistics chain to bring in needed resources is long, expensive, and time-consuming. In many ways, this is the first truly catastrophic disaster in U.S. history. To put this into context, early estimates of the cost by FEMA alone, which we are now told are likely to rise, indicate that the hurricanes represent an event with impact that's 2.5 times the size of Hurricane Katrina as measured on a per capita basis. No state anywhere is organized in peacetime to handle this magnitude of situation on their own, at least not at the beginning. In fact, the nation's emergency management structure is specifically designed on this premise, under the common understanding that it is impossible and impractical to maintain an apparatus of that size and complexity just in case a disaster occurs. To do otherwise is neither reasonable nor fiscally responsible. Here in Puerto Rico, we had plans in place and teams of personnel in PREMA and other agencies who engaged before, during, and after the storms, and have worked alongside their FEMA and other federal counterparts on immediate response. But like everyone else on the island, government capacity was itself a casualty of these catastrophic storms, and it has taken us time to reconstitute our teams. This is why you saw the large federal response to the hurricanes in Puerto Rico. Our emergency management system is designed on the basis that disaster response starts at the local level, and assistance becomes available at progressively higher levels of government as capabilities get exceeded and resources are depleted. That is also why our counterparts from across the country are here helping with response. Long prior to the hurricanes, Puerto Rico joined the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, or EMAC, which is a nationally adopted mutual aid agreement among states to share resources during times of need. We moved aggressively in the aftermath of Irma and Maria to tap into this resource to help supplement our response organization with seasoned and trained experts, as well as to deliver key assistance in the field for activities such as power restoration, security, water, and other critical needs where state and local government was understandably overwhelmed. This is all part of the plan, the design of how emergency management works in our country. And this is why PREMA and the state agencies have been rapidly building capacity, both organically and through the engagement of expert contractor support, and are ramping up their efforts to restore government operations and deliver increased assistance to support the response and recovery efforts. With all that in mind, I am providing you with some slides that will give you an update on where things stand today with our efforts. In the face of this catastrophic incident, we have moved aggressively to build a capacity to provide technical assistance to those state agencies, municipalities, and PMPs who experienced damages and are in need of financial assistance. At the grantee level, we have put in place and continue to build a team augmented by some of the most qualified FEMA and recovery consultants in the country to assist with managing the grant process. The organization we've built and which we continue to expand, provides not only command and control capability, but also expert staffing who are reviewing every request for resources, project worksheet, or hazard mitigation application that is being developed at the state or municipal level. Also, we have and will continue to provide technical assistance to state agencies and local applicants that is tailored to their specific needs. To do this, the team is being organized around specific areas of interest so that we can meet the needs of every applicant in every region of the country. We have dedicated teams established for state agencies, PMPs, and municipalities divided up into Eastern, Central, and Western zones. By organizing in that manner, the people on each team can maintain continuity with their applicants and help resolve funding issues throughout the response and recovery period. We can also shift resources between teams as priorities or requirements change. This structure is one that has been tested and utilized as a best practice across the United States. Using this structure, we have already moved quickly to deliver assistance for response and to initiate recovery. As you are probably aware, FEMA only approved funding for debris removal and emergency protective measures initially under this disaster declaration, and only recently approved permanent work. That said, we have made a good deal of progress getting funding to those most in need to cover related expenses. As of the end of last week, we obligated over $426.7 million to 166 state agencies, municipalities, and PMPs. $377.3 million of the total amount of obligated funds has already dispersed to those state agencies and municipalities most in need. For permanent work on public buildings and infrastructure, FEMA and the government of Puerto Rico are planning to implement an alternative approach under Section 428 of the Stafford Act that will allow us to develop cost estimates for eligible projects and establish a capped amount of funding, including hazard mitigation, that can then be used to build back in a manner that addresses Puerto Rico's current and future requirements, rather than simply building back what was there before. This is a novel approach that was first implemented after Superstorm Sandy, but which has never been done across an entire disaster. As a result, we are working with FEMA on developing the guidance on how this will be implemented across all of Puerto Rico, and are beginning the engagement process with municipalities as early as this week to share information and seek feedback. We are hopeful that the use of Section 428 will streamline the time it takes to build back and help us to do so to achieve greater efficiencies and resiliency in the years to come. Although we continue to be involved in active response operations in many parts of the island, nearly 75 days into the hurricane disasters, we have also been preparing aggressively for recovery, building upon best practices both nationally and internationally. Toward this end, the governor issued an executive order about 4 weeks ago to establish a central recovery and reconstruction office for Puerto Rico. The central office mission, simply put, is to obtain resources, provide financial accountability and oversight for recovery dollars and programs, coordinate government efforts supporting the recovery, provide guidance and technical assistance, and direct the overall recovery effort. Omar Marrero, the current executive director of the Public-Private Partnership Authority, the Ports Authority, and the Convention Center District, was selected by the governor to lead this organization and the longer-term recovery effort on behalf of the government. Mr. Marrero will be extracting himself from most of his prior obligations to work on the disaster recovery effort on a full-time basis. Since he was named by the governor for this significant new role, Mr. Marrero has been hard at work developing the organizational structure, budget, and work plan for the central office. And in fact, the P3 Authority will be officially creating the organization within its organizational construct tomorrow on December 6th. The P3 Authority was chosen as the home for the central office due to its track record of success, its demonstrated capability managing and implementing large-scale construction projects, and its experience working across all of government and the private sector to achieve results. Mr. Marrero has also led a government-wide effort to develop Puerto Rico's first request for federal supplemental appropriations for recovery, which is currently before the Congress. That request was designed to give Congress an idea of the overall scope and magnitude of the needs we expect to have in the coming years, including for funding to support building back a more resilient Puerto Rico. And we remain hopeful that Congress will provide an initial down payment on that request during the month of December. The supplemental request is a good example of part of the role for the central office as envisioned by the governor. Simply put, the central office is charged with speaking with one voice on behalf of Puerto Rico's recovery needs. But in addition to that mandate, the Central Recovery Office is committed to making this disaster recovery the most transparent one in U.S. history, providing unmatched accountability for the use of funds. It is also meant to break down the stovepipes of the traditional government structure to allow Puerto Rico to address recovery needs holistically across issues, areas, and agencies. The need for this type of entity to coordinate and direct recovery efforts here in Puerto Rico is clear, but is also considered a best practice after large disasters where substantial new funding is made available and recovery issues are highly complex. Similar organizations were developed and implemented in places such as Louisiana and Mississippi after Hurricane Katrina, Iowa after the 2008 Midwest floods, New York and New Jersey after Superstorm Sandy, and several other multi-billion-dollar events. The governor looked at these and other recovery organizations in an effort to take the best from each and then strengthen the model to allow Puerto Rico to have increased control over recovery priorities and programs, exercise additional oversight, offer greater transparency, and implement stronger financial management controls. I am pleased to report that we coordinate closely with Mike Byrne, the federal coordinating officer for the two Puerto Rico disasters, on the development of this new organization. In fact, Mike told us this weekend that he believed an organization like this is absolutely necessary and that he supports the concept of the central office and the opportunity that it will provide to ensure transparency and work seamlessly with the federal community. I know that the Promesa board has a great deal of interest in controls being implemented. I am pleased to say that what the governor and Omar Marrero are doing with the central office provides, by all accounts, including FEMA, the strongest control structure ever implemented after a major disaster. But there's more. Puerto Rico will be engaging an internationally recognized accounting firm to help us develop financial controls, policies, and procedures, provide ongoing quality and conduct assessment to protect against duplication of benefits and fraud. As part of government reform and restructuring, the governor has advanced the establishment of a centralized procurement office within the AFAF. This group will be staffed by procurement experts whose sole mission will be to implement the procurement process on behalf of the government and ensure that all contracting meets the requirements of both Puerto Rico and the federal government, including the requirements of 2 CFR Part 200. They will also serve as the coordination point with the Promesa board for any contracts over $10 million in value as currently envisioned in the contracting policy. Puerto Rico is and will be utilizing expert third-party consultants with expertise in managing FEMA, HUD, and other federal program funds to augment Puerto Rico's staffing so that the Commonwealth will have more capacity and can properly manage grant dollars. The Central Office and the Puerto Rico Office of Management and Budget have established multiple checks and balances for the approval of both contract and payments to provide accountability. Each action in these areas will require review and approval by the heads of the Office of Management and Budget and the Central Office, and will be reviewed by an internationally recognized accounting firm as described earlier. Both the Central Office and the GAR have committed to utilizing proven grants management software systems that capture project documentation and provide business process controls related to the grant preparation, review, and approval process, as well as address grant program requirements and protects against duplication of benefits. And the Central Office has announced its plans to develop and implement a transparency portal that will provide visibility related to how funds are being used and where. In addition to the steps being taken by Puerto Rico, you should also understand that federal oversight of the response and recovery funds will be stringent as well, something that we welcome. In fact, we are working with FEMA and the other federal agencies to ensure enhanced accountability. As you would expect, each funding agency will continue to implement their existing policies and protocols to oversee funds and activities implemented through their programs. But in an unprecedented action, Puerto Rico has agreed to allow FEMA to approve every drawdown for public assistance and hazard mitigation grant program funds, consistent with FEMA's guidelines developed specifically for Puerto Rico. Normally, after FEMA approves a project for funding, the state government can draw down funds as required without additional FEMA approval. To provide enhanced accountability, Omar Marrero and his team have already met with the Inspectors General offices from several funding agencies and is inviting them to provide oversight and maintain a presence in the Central Recovery Office to make sure they understand how funds are being used and can raise concerns should any exist. Also, in the structure of the Central Recovery Office, Puerto Rico is welcoming of federal involvement and is including multiple coordination points in the organizational structure so that federal departments and agencies can have some level of visibility and participation in the recovery planning and implementation process. Hurricanes Irma and Maria present an unprecedented challenge, but we are doing what needs to be done and are making progress towards delivering needed assistance, stabilizing the situation here in Puerto Rico, and setting the stage for disaster recovery. It is important to remember that it's been only about 10 weeks since not one, but two Category 5 hurricane disasters impacted our island. And despite the fact that we are all survivors whose lives have been impacted and communities have been devastated, we have done a remarkable amount in a very short time. There is still a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done, and we continue to build and grow the operation that we will need to manage response and recovery efforts in the weeks, months, and years to come. But I remain confident that we've got this. We will be able to manage the disaster, deliver needed financial and technical assistance, and all the while maintain the necessary controls to provide financial accountability. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sobrino. Would any members of the board like to ask a question of Christian? No? Let's move on then. Now I would like to ask, if I may, the team of FOMB and the Treasury Department to come forward, please. Thank you. If you could please identify yourselves for purpose of the record, and welcome.
My name is Francisco Pares. I'm representing Mr. Secretary of the Puerto Rico Treasury, Raul Maldonado, and I am currently the Assistant Secretary for Internal Revenue and Tax Policy areas for the Puerto Rico Treasury Department.
Good morning. My name is Edwin Rios. I am the Assistant Secretary of Economic and Financial Affairs at Treasury Department.
First, the Secretary wanted to be here personally, but he's currently in Washington, D.C., making efforts to introduce Puerto Rico into the U.S. tax reform. So he delegated this meeting to me so I can make some representations to the board. He wrote a letter, so I'll be reading the letter for you and then talking a little bit more in detail with respect to the federal reform impact in Puerto Rico. As you may know, over the last few months, I have been, the Secretary has been advocating alongside with Governor Rosselló, the Puerto Rico Federal Affairs Administration, and Resident Commissioner Jennifer Gonzalez, to members of Congress and the executive branch for the inclusion of Puerto Rico into the upcoming tax reform legislation. Today, he will continue these efforts, highlighting the tax reform agenda focused on promoting Puerto Rico compliance with PROMESA, enhancing economic growth, and the creation of private sector jobs. We are asking one of two guiding principles. The first one, equal treatment of Puerto Rico as a U.S. jurisdiction, provide a 100% protection from the base erosion and global intangible low tax income provision of the House and Senate for all existing and U.S. controlled foreign entities operating in the U.S. customs territory, for example, Puerto Rico. Or promote economic growth and preserve existing manufacturing jobs in Puerto Rico. This might provide partial protection from this base erosion, and this shall be applicable to all existing and U.S. controlled foreign corporations operating in Puerto Rico and other U.S. customs territory. The impact, as you may already know, might trigger erosion of the Puerto Rico tax revenues of approximately a third of the total revenues that Puerto Rico earns through its tax system. And this risk, it's only taking into consideration the direct impact of the manufacturing industry. This is not considering all the indirect impact that might have in other industries as well. Also, Puerto Rico has to make an introspection and an analysis of its current tax system, because there are another tier of concerns with respect to the US tax reform. For example, the reduction of the tax rate from the corporate tax regime. This might impact the Puerto Rico revenues in other segments of the private sector industries. For example, the retail industry, where the sharing activity economy, which large taxpayers are currently involved, might influence these taxpayers to use transfer pricing elements to transfer profits from Puerto Rico to the mainland, because it will be taxed at a lower rate. This is critical for us. It's not only the manufacturing industry, which our efforts are currently in Washington, D.C., which the government is currently working, because this is critical and might be another catastrophe for Puerto Rico if we don't achieve the goal to introduce Puerto Rico into the tax legislation. But also, the Puerto Rico Treasury Department and the government has to make changes to the current tax system in Puerto Rico to ascertain that Puerto Rico is competitive from a global standpoint, and to attack any sharing economy activity risk. For example, the transfer pricing rules that I already mentioned. So with this, we are open to additional questions that you may have. So this is basically our general presentation with respect to our efforts that has consisted in meetings with the private sector, meeting with the resident commissioner. As a matter of fact, yesterday and Friday, we were with the private sector joining forces so they can also raise awareness in the Congress. And as we speak, this multi-sectoral segment of the private sector, it's now in the Congress raising the voice and raising awareness to the people in the US, so Puerto Rico can be introduced in the federal tax reform.
Thank you very much. Do any members of the board have questions for these gentlemen?
Yes, if you don't mind, I would like to understand more specifically. I mean, you have outlined that Puerto Rico wants to incorporate itself onto the discussion on the tax reform on the conference committee, but can you explain exactly what's the position, what is the governor and the administration seeking to do? And I would also like to understand what are the difference, if any, with other positions, for example, of the resident commissioner, to understand, I mean, what are the efforts that are currently being done?
Well, this, let me talk a little bit of more background. The current federal tax reform changes its regime from a worldwide income to a territorial regime. This territorial regime imposes, for example, the House bill proposed a 20% excise tax on cross-border transactions. This will be applicable for sales made from Puerto Rico operating entities to the US mainland. We need to remember that almost all our manufacturing sales are done to related parties which operated in the mainland, so most probably will be subject to this 20% tax regime. The Senate bill, even though reduces the burden on similar transactions, also puts a lot of burden, and even though it's a reduced one, still puts in jeopardy the manufacturing entities in Puerto Rico. The government, what it's trying is, first, consider Puerto Rico as a domestic jurisdiction for purposes of these cross-border transactions. And this makes a lot of sense because Puerto Rico is subject to the Dormant Commerce Clause. And as a matter of fact, Puerto Rico previously imposed a similar tax for transactions paid to related parties who are operating in the mainland and other jurisdictions. And this provision of the alternative minimum tax was struck down by the federal court. So it's fair to say that even Puerto Rico, since it's considered a territory subject to the regulations of the U.S., which increase the cost of making business in Puerto Rico and producing inventory, and it's subject to the Interstate Commerce Clause, well, it's fair to say that we should be considered as a domestic businesses in the U.S. for purposes of these cross-border transactions. I don't think that the resident commissioner approach is different to the governor's approach. All we want is to treat Puerto Rico fairly in a fair fashion for purposes of this tax regime. But what we want is to treat Puerto Rico in a domestic fashion so we can avoid that imposition, at least from a partial perspective. Because even though we are on the same terms as other foreign entities that will be subject to this cross-border tax, they are not subject to federal regulations, which increases the cost of doing business in that foreign jurisdiction, and they are not subject to the Interstate Commerce Clause. So for us, it's critical that since we are domestic for things that provide us some regulatory burdens, so we need to be considered as domestic entity for the good as well. And since Puerto Rico, it's a partner for the U.S., and almost all of our transactions are done with the private sector, and which includes plenty of business in the U.S., it is fair to say that we should be excluded for this cross-border adjustment tax.
So just to clarify, that's and then the position of the resident commissioner is the same.
I believe we are on the same path, trying to mitigate these cross-border taxes in Puerto Rico, and trying to maintain the existing tax base that currently we have in Puerto Rico, because it's critical for us in order to comply with PROMESA and with the certified fiscal plan to have this tax base and protect a third of all the tax revenues that we already are providing.
But as I understand, I mean, the approach may be the same. I mean, obviously the goal is the same. I think we all want to be sure that, that this effect is mitigated, and we understand the harsh consequences if it is not. But as I understand, there's no common language in terms of how to be able to achieve that. I mean, on one end, you're explaining that the approach is to be able to treat these corporations as domestic. But as I understand, there are other features that are being proposed, and that's what I'm trying to understand, if there's a common language or not into a single position to be able to solve and have one voice in Congress.
I can tell you that Resident Commissioner has met with the Puerto Rico Secretary of the Treasury, and we have shared legislation language, so she can do her best effort to introduce that language on the bill. So I think we are.
Excuse me, the resident commissioner is elected official. She can speak for herself at any moment. Mr. Pares is qualified to speak on the position of Treasury. The resident commissioner has made her statements public, and if this board would like to receive her input, I am sure that the board could invite her to present at one of these proceedings or be called by any member of this board, which I am sure she will take the call immediately. So I think it would be, what's fair with Mr. Pares is to permit him to respond to issues regarding Treasury and the Puerto Rico government, and let the resident commissioner, as an elected official, speak for herself.
That's a valid observation. We're just asking if it's the same.
Well, maybe Mr. Sobrino, you can expand, because what I'm trying to understand is what are the efforts that are being done, what is the position, and how those are being coordinated. Maybe you can talk about those matters.
Regarding the efforts, I can tell you that, as Mr. Pares has indicated, the Treasury Secretary and the governor and the officials from PRAFA have met with the resident commissioner. They have also met with private sector industry leaders in Puerto Rico and have established the Frente for Puerto Rico strategy, where we are also presenting multi-party, multi-stakeholder visits to the capital to present a unified front on the position that Mr. Pares mentioned earlier today. What I cannot do is to speak for the resident commissioner. That is her role, and that is her responsibility, and I would not think she appreciates that I give her positions for her.
I see. Does anybody have any additional questions?
I actually do have some questions, Mr. Chairman, if I can be recognized.
But of course.
Francisco, do you know who Frederick Tripp Bird and Jennifer Bird are of Off-Hill Strategies?
I'm sorry?
Do you know who Frederick Tripp Bird and Jennifer Bird of Off-Hill Strategies are?
Personally, I don't know who they are.
Okay. Do you know who David Starr, George Baker, and others from Williams and Jensen are? Do you know who they are?
Personally, no, I don't know them.
They are lobbyists hired by the Oversight Board to lobby Congress. Have you had any do you know if the secretary or anybody from the Puerto Rico government has had any interaction with them regarding tax reform?
Well, the secretary has not represented to me any conversation that he had with those persons that you mentioned.
Nor to me. So lobbyists are being contracted with Puerto Rican funds to lobby Congress, and we are not aware of what actions they are carrying out regarding tax reform?
At least personally, I don't know who they are or their role, and the secretary have not mentioned me anything with respect to that.
Yes, then, Mr. Chairman, I would recommend that a memorandum be provided to all board members, including the ex-officio member, regarding all efforts that are being carried out by Off-Hill Strategies and Williams and Jensen with Puerto Rican funds regarding their lobbying efforts in Congress, regarding tax reform or any other effort that they are carrying out. I reviewed the contracts for these entities earlier today. They have only one work order. It has nothing to do with tax reform. It's very vague and does not include any other work orders that have been contracted by the board with Puerto Rican funds since then. And I would invite that this memorandum be provided post-haste so that we can all know what is being spoken about Puerto Rico in Congress immediately. Thank you.
We would be happy to provide you with a memorandum as to what the government affairs people are doing. And in the future, all you have to do is ask for it.
We have asked in the past to executive members of the board for this type of information, not for the memorandum, but we will do so regarding your recommendation. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I may be recognized, I would like to make a reciprocal request to the government and to Mr. Sobrino, that I think will be good to understand exactly what are the efforts that the government is conducting, to be able to understand the formal position and language that the government has, so this board can be informed and understand also what are all the efforts, so the board can see in what other ways the board can be supportive of all the efforts that are being conducted in such an important topic.
That memorandum will be provided immediately.
Thank you.
Do any members have any additional questions for these gentlemen? Thank you very much.
Thanks to you. Thanks to everyone.
So I would like to ask, if I may, to welcome Mr. Portela, the Executive Director of AFAF, who will present the financial and liquidity status of the government of Puerto Rico, as well as information on actual government expenditures compared to budget amounts. Mr. Portela is accompanied by his team, whom he will present. Please. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good morning. Good morning, esteemed members of the board, colleagues, and the public in attendance. My name is Gerardo Portela Franco, Executive Director of FOMB. I'm joined today by my colleague, Mohammed Yassin, Chief Legal Officer of FOMB, our counsel, Mr. John Ripasardi, Mr. Dustin Mundell from Rothschild, Aurelio Garcia, and Jesse York from Conway McKinsey. Thank you for inviting me to discuss the government's revised near-term funding needs, liquidity update, and budget to actual update. I know that the agenda for this meeting lists the liquidity update and budget to actual update as separate items, but this presentation is intended to provide both a liquidity update and a budget to actual update. We have worked with the board to understand with greater certainty the government's pre- and post-hurricane liquidity position through December 29, 2017. As you're all aware, this is an ongoing task, has been essential to our ability to project the government's near-term funding needs. To that end, the board has asked FOMB to discuss the government's liquidity position during Q1 of fiscal year 2018, budgeted versus actual expenditures during that period, and the government's funding needs. Do we have a... Since the board's 10th public meeting on October 31st, we have continued to collaborate with the board and its advisors on several initiatives. First, as I noted earlier, we have been working with the board to assess liquidity needs in the near term. The initial 180 days following the hurricane and medium term through the end of fiscal year 2019 have been our primary focus. Second, we have been working with FEMA and the U.S. Treasury to complete the process of obtaining community disaster relief loans for the Commonwealth, as well as other governmental instrumentalities. Third, we have been tirelessly working on developing and submitting a revised fiscal plan to the board by December 22nd deadline for the Commonwealth, PREPA, and PRASA. Finally, in addition, as part of the enhancing public reporting, we have begun posting weekly Treasury single account reports starting on October 30th. We know that these are preliminary, unaudited results. As more data becomes available, particularly related to FEMA disaster relief spending and the impact of Hurricane Maria on Q2 revenue collections, FOMB with the information certified by the GAR and the Treasury, and the FOMB will continue to revise the immediate term assessment of liquidity needs. The following slides will include, one, a review of actual versus forecast of Q1 of fiscal year 2018 for the 3-month ending September 30th, 2017 for the TSA, PREPA, and PRASA. And second, updated liquidity outlook through December 29, 2017, and revised estimated funding needs. This slide sets out Q1 actual to forecast liquidity. Taking a step back, I would like to point out that reporting the actual to forecast liquidity is currently our most accurate and insightful measurement of budget to actual. This slide illustrates on a cash basis what the government actually spent and received against its budget reflected in the forecast. As set out in the second column, inflows for Q1 of fiscal year 2018 were previously forecasted at $4.3 billion. As set out in the first column, actual inflows were $3.9 billion for a negative variance of $443 million, or 10.1%. Outflows were forecasted at $4.3 billion. Actual outflows were $3.7 billion for a positive variance of $584 million, or 13.6%. The variance in inflows and outflows can be attributed to several key drivers: federal fund receipts, appropriations to component units, vendor disbursements, and general collections. The Q1 negative variance in federal fund receipt was around 20%. This negative variance is largely due to timing related and offset by positive variances in both vendor disbursements and assessed payments of Medicare premiums and claims. We expect these positive variances related to the disbursements and assessed payments will reverse through the remainder of the year as receipts and disbursements normalize. Of the $134 million positive variance in appropriations to component units in Q1, around 89 million is related to pass-through federal appropriations to assess for payments of Medicare premiums. The remaining 45 million in variance is timing related and expected to reverse in the near term. This variance resulted from certain expenses that did not accrue in September due to the hurricanes and as a result rolled over Q2. As previously noted, Hurricane Maria impaired the government's agencies' invoice processing capabilities and created temporary variance in vendor disbursements. While it's important to remember that this Q1 analysis is largely pre-hurricane, the forecast proved accurate with minimal material variance and largely due to timing. Next page, next slide. This slide shows a detailed breakdown of collections for the actual and forecasted liquidity plan. Through August, before the hurricanes, general collections were approximately $100 million favorable compared to the forecast. Hurricane Maria's impact on the last 2 weeks of September brought collections closer in line with fiscal year Q1 forecast. The largest impact from the hurricane was due to individual tax collections, which was lower than forecast by $65 million, or 13% from Q1. Act 154 and non-resident withholding collections were largely insulated and ended 6% and 53% favorable to forecast, respectively. In addition, pass-through collections of petroleum, oil, and gasoline tax drove special revenue fund favorable to the forecast by around 12%. While there was some favorable variance in collections, actual collections were largely in line with forecast Q1 of fiscal year 2018. However, it is important to remember that Hurricane Maria made landfall on September 20th. Fiscal year Q1 ended September 30th. Thus, we did not expect the effects of Hurricane Maria to be reflected in Q1 inflows and outflows. Instead, we expect to see, and are in fact beginning to see, negative effects on revenue collections beginning in Q2. In fact, preliminary data for October indicates a 37% decline in collections versus forecast. Next slide. Thank you. PREPA has experienced a negative variance in revenues and around a 5.7% negative variance in expenses for the budget Q1 fiscal year 2018. PREPA's revenues were budgeted at $870.3 million. Its actual revenues through September were approximately $821 million. Note that PREPA's Q1 actual expenses and revenues are determined based on accrual accounting. This means that the numbers contained herein may not reflect actual cash inflows and outflows. The main drivers of the positive variance in expenses were approximately 29.6% decrease in purchase power and a 19.5% decrease in operating expenses. PREPA operates on a cost recovery basis. This means that the rates are adjusted to ensure that revenues meet expenses. For the first 2 months of fiscal year 2018, actual current expenses were greater than budgeted, primarily due to greater consumption of fuel oils versus budget, approximately 4.1 million versus a 3.1 million respectively, and a higher fuel oil prices than was projected in the budget, approximately prices $61 versus $57.17 respectively. As a result, energy sales were greater than budgeted, primarily due to the pass-through effect of the fuel oil adjustment change. September year-to-date revenues, however, and current expenses were less than budgeted, primarily due to the material business interruption as a result of Hurricane Irma and Maria on September 6th and September 20th, respectively. In particular, actual kilowatt hours per sales for the month of September were 28.4% lower than budgeted. In sum, Q1 results for PREPA were largely in line with forecast. Variance is attributable to volume and price of fuel, which has offsetting impact in both revenue and expenses. However, again, we know that we expect the effects of Hurricane Maria to begin materializing in Q2. Next slide. PROSA experienced a 50.6% negative variance in revenues and a 29.7% variance in operating expenses during Q1 fiscal year 18. Actual revenues were approximately $228 million versus budgeted revenues of $270 million. Total operating expenses were budgeted approximately $180 million. Actual operating expenses were $126 million. The main drivers of the positive variance were a 26.3% decrease in payroll costs due to the timing of pension pay-go amounts and a change in headcount. A 32.1% decrease in electricity costs due to the period when PREPA was offline following Hurricane Maria. Third, a 30.4% decrease in materials renewals and replacement costs. And fourth, a 35% decrease in other operating expenses versus the budgeted amounts. The positive variance in expenses is also attributable to debt service savings related to the forbearance agreement with federal creditors and a smaller than forecasted transfer to the construction fund. A substantial drop in September revenues was mitigated through operational savings and a forbearance with federal creditors to result in revenue that are largely in line with forecasts when compared against operating expenses. Next slide. Our liquidity assessment for Q2 of fiscal year 2018 is that we will need approximately $781 million, which is approximately $2.8 billion lower than the original forecast. These are primary drivers of the difference in the current assessment and the original forecast. First, our disaster relief spending from TSA has been approximately $1.4 billion more favorable than October 31st projection. Due to timing of certain expenditures, working capital provided by FOMB activities has been higher than anticipated, reducing spending from the TSA. In addition, the government has benefited from a $1.1 billion in favorable cash flow relative to the October 31st projection. The favorable cash flow is comprised of, one, a $700 million positive variance to macroeconomic forecast. The positive variance was driven primarily by a revised assumption on the fiscal year 2018-2019 population outmigration, which revised the prior estimate of 15% down to 10%. And thus the inclusion of the positive impact of federal disaster spending and the positive impact of inflation, which resulted from supply disruptions and other storm-related price increases. $220 million temporary variance due to operational constraints in processing and paying invoices. In other words, because certain systems were down in the immediate aftermath of the hurricanes, there was a delay in the payment and processing. And last, $180 million related to better than expected corporate and Act 154 revenue collections. The October 31st forecast discounted these collections due to the impact of the hurricane, but several large organizations paid in November for the pre-Maria period. There has also been a $274 million improvement related to PREPA and PRASA cash flows developed as of October 31st. $260 million related to PREPA and a $40 million attributable to PRASA. Our efforts have continued to focus on obtaining immediate federal government funding through the CDLs for PREPA and PRASA to ensure the stability of these public entities or utilities. From the very first day, the funding need through the fiscal year 2019 has been developed in close coordination with the FOMB, the board, and its advisors. Although not finalized, a substantial funding needs is anticipated. The assessment of funding needs for Q2 has been revised downward, but the revision is significantly impacted by certain temporary positive variances that we do not expect to persist. As a result, we expect liquidity to deteriorate going forward, creating a need for substantial external funding. That's okay, that's slide 7, okay. This slide shows the Treasury single account actual cash balance through October 6th and a projected cash balance through December 29th versus the minimum cash level that must be maintained in that account. The actual cash results for the Treasury single account are in line with forecasts through when Hurricane Maria made landfall. However, near-term liquidity is expected to decline as collections from pre-Maria activities conclude, and second, a disaster and recovery-related spending grows. Cash has remained in the $1.7 billion to $2 billion range. The cash balance has been supported by better than expected collections from pre-Maria Act 154 and corporate tax activity, and as previously noted, a slower than anticipated payment of vendor invoices. Act 154 and corporate tax collections are expected to decrease as collections for the post-Maria period begin. Revenues are expected to decrease as the Commonwealth disaster spending increases. The TSA must maintain a minimum cash level of $1.3 billion. We've expressed this before. The minimum cash level is composed of a $900 million operating reserve, which is more conservative than the typical $300 million level. We are operating with a higher reserve due to uncertainty regarding disaster and recovery funding and the potential need to fund municipalities and public corporations. Weekly average disbursements are approximately $300 million to $400 million a week, of which approximately $100 million in payroll and around $60 million in supplier payments. We also have another reserve around approximately $400 million, which is reserved for professional fees in connection with Title III cases and related restructuring matters, which are not accounted for in the fiscal year 2018 budget and are contingent on litigation outcomes. By the end of the calendar year, we project that the TSA cash balance to be approximately $1.4 billion. Next slide. Okay, there. This slide shows PREPA and process actual cash balances through September and projected cash balance through December 29th versus the minimum cash level that must be maintained by each entity. Both utilities are quickly approaching negative cash balance, are in dire need of additional funding. In terms of PREPA, PREPA's actual cash results are also consistent with forecasts pre-Maria, and its cash balance was relatively stable through Q1. However, we expect PREPA's cash balance to begin reflecting strain from post-Maria drop in receipts and near-term disaster recovery spending. These factors will result in an acute need for additional funding. PREPA is currently operating on operational reserves, and we expect those reserves to be depleted by the middle of December. PREPA needs to maintain a minimum operating cash level of approximately $537 million. But through December 29th, we estimate the ending cash balance at a negative $244 million, thus creating a funding need for $726 million. PREPA's minimum operating cash level is based on its 60-day operating budget. The primary drivers of this projected decline are, first, payments of due invoices for amounts due in October and November as scheduled for December. Second, disaster spending is currently being funded from PREPA's general fund, which includes supplier payments and overtime. And third, the run rate for consumer collections will be reduced due to the impact of Hurricane Maria. PREPA is in need of additional funding. In terms of process cash has declined significantly since Hurricane Maria, from approximately $120 million to $66 million. We expect that PRASA will have a dire liquidity need in fiscal year Q2 as the effects of Maria continue to materialize in receipt reduction and increased spending. PRASA needs to maintain a minimum operating cash level of $120 million through December 29th. We estimate the ending cash balance at a negative $1 million, thus creating a shortfall for $121 million. PRASA's minimum operating cash level is based, as well as PRASA, for a 60-day operating budget. Similarly, PRASA's liquidity position may affect the TSA if external financing is not received. With that, we have concluded our presentation, and we welcome any questions that the board may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Portela. Would any members of the board have any questions for Mr. Portela?
Yes. I believe you mentioned that there was a 37% decline in tax revenue for October. My question, if I'm correct, what taxes attribute to that decline?
So it's largely across the board It's largely across the board with the exception of corporate taxes are actually still trending close to forecast in Act 154, but all of the individual non-resident holding alcohol, cigarette taxes are all trending below the forecast. I've slightly updated figures, so through, I think, about last week, overall taxes were about 27% worse than forecast, so a little bit of an improvement over the 37% that was shown there. But that's including large collections in November on Act 154 and corporate taxes, specifically from one large organization. So if you normalize for that, you're still about 35% below forecast on everything else, with individual being 34% off, cigarette being 38% off. Those are the largest. SUT's actually 59% off too.
Also, Judge, we wanted to let you know also that there's a meeting scheduled tomorrow with Ernst & Young, and we will provide those numbers in specifics.
All right, thank you. The other question I have is how do you expect PREPA to close the gap, the funding gap? What are you looking at to do that?
In terms for PREPA, well, they've been, well, they've been trying to preserve, you know, due to the timing of, they've been trying to preserve the cash available by managing the timing of vendor payments. Also, you know, also the emergency-related spend currently being funded, you know, includes those vendor payments as well. So they've been trying to manage APs. I don't know if there's something else that we want. What? Yeah, we're also currently working with the Treasury, having calls on a daily basis, trying to get the CDL funding for PREP as well.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Judge.
Any additional questions? I have a question.
Mr. Portello, you suggested or said that part of the 2.88 billion that the required, I'm trying to come up with the words, the sort of good news about the liquidity situation and the revenue situation that it was you're $2.88 billion better off than you thought you were going to be. Yeah. One big chunk of that was $700 million that weren't spent or you're in more favorable position because of changes in macroeconomic assumptions. Correct. Could you say a bit more about that? You suggested that it was lowered expectations for migration. I'd be interested in hearing why those expectations lowered and also how that translated into $700 million.
Sure. So yes, that's a good question. So basically, baseline revenues were forecasted to decline approximately 39% in fiscal year 18 and 31% in fiscal year 19. There's been a change due to favorable macroeconomic assumptions in which population declined from 15% in fiscal year 18 to 10%. That impacted favorably towards collections, towards collection and positive revenues for the government of Puerto Rico, which that decline in population estimate actually changed our fiscal year 18 revenues from 39% to 25%, and our fiscal year 19 revenues at 31% declined to 10%. So that had a positive impact on revenues, thus that $700 million. I don't know if you guys wanted to add something else.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, when that forecast was developed prior to the 1031 meeting, I think we were using the general macro assumption of the 15% from the Hunter College report or something close to that. Then as we've refined that analysis with the help of DevTech as we work on this analysis as well as the fiscal plan, there was the revision to GMP due to two factors. One, the out-migration reduction based on kind of updated data. Then also, more importantly, probably the FEMA spend, the positive benefit from that was not accounted for kind of the initial baseline analysis. So that creates an uptick in GMP, which is then translating into revenue.
Great.
And It should be also noted that that is for the first quarter. Obviously, after the impact of the two hurricanes, out-migration has increased, so we would probably expect a corresponding negative in the coming months. So just wanted to make that clarification.
Another question, and that is, could you say a little bit more about your expectations for vendor payments? What's been done so far, what you expect going forward?
Sure. So prior to Hurricane Maria, there was a positive variance, approximately as of 9/15. There's a positive variance in vendor payments of vendor disbursement around $92 million due to slower than forecasted cadence for invoice processing. And additionally, this invoice has been, due to the hurricane, this invoice has been further hindered due to the technical issues stemming from the same. Manual invoice data entry is the main driver of slower invoice processing. So that's actually affects, has the effect on that variance in vendor disbursements. I don't know if you guys wanted to add anything else.
I guess related, just sort of to plug in a related question, that is, what do you expect going forward? Is this going to continue? Is there going to continue to be a drag, or is this going to be fixed? Or
we assume that it is temporary in nature,
correct,
and therefore should be reverted back. I think that from our estimations, there's approximately 220 to 250 range of buildup in APs throughout this year that should be assimilated back into the cash flow. We're not assuming, and there's not a policy to maintain or keeping building up the vendor payment. So I think that we're addressing, since before the hurricane, we've been addressing the issue of processing of invoices, and we're still working on that, but we should deal with that by the third quarter or into the fourth quarter of this year.
I kind of wanted to add, thank you, Aurelio. I kind of want to add that, again, and adding to what Aurelio said, we expect this to reverse, right, as technical issues are resolved. And actually, I wanted to add that it will largely depend on how quickly these largest agencies adapt, such as, Department of Education, Health, et cetera. So, we expect it to reverse, and, and it'll be highly dependent on how these, large agencies resume to a normal cadence.
All right. Thank you. Anyone else?
A few questions. So just staying on that topic, so what's the current amount of accounts payable as of the most recent date that you have accounted for that it's currently outstanding?
I don't know the exact figure in front of me, but I think as of a week or two in the TSA report is just over 500 million, which is relatively flat from where it was in September. And I think the issue is, or our hypothesis is, just a lot of invoices aren't getting processed into the system, and that's the roughly 250.
So the question is, what's being done to try to accelerate? Because obviously that, I mean, I understand given the issues, the complications that are in the process, but this has been an issue even prior to the hurricane. I mean, making sure that invoices are processing times are accounted in the system. So what is being done? And second, I mean, what's the amount that you estimate that may be out there beyond the $500 million that were on the last TSA liquidity report?
I'm going to try to answer both questions. The first one, what has been done? I think that there has been consistent progress, and at this point, we have total control on the AP ledger of invoices that are recorded into Hacienda's system. We have what I would call substantial control, and that is comparative to last year and the beginning of this year. Substantial control on invoices that are being recorded at 20 largest agencies. We do not have control on the invoices that, or the process for recording invoices on the other agencies, other than just putting the, circular letters and guidance. But when I say we have control, is that there's advisors from the government supporting the financial function at the 20 top agencies. There's an issue with the non-recorded invoices, and that is something that it will be progressively and continually gathered. But at one point, we don't know what we don't know. We need to look for those invoices and test and do cross-checks, and that's where we do it. We're going to focus on the 20 agencies and then deploy the efforts into the subsequent. In terms of what we believe is floating as unrecorded invoices, we believe that there's a first stack of between 220 and 250 million in invoices that are not recorded and are on top of those 500 million. And then there's a risk that we are addressing with Hacienda on any other potential gap. And I'm going to tell you one example. There's multi-year contracts, but the budget phrasing establishes that there's no payment of past year invoices into the next year for the budget. So we need to deal with that. And at the agency level, there's a lot of confusion how to deal with that. So those are elements that are creating some holes in the process at the agency level. So we need to go and work one by one on those. But in general terms, and I think it's a reasonable estimation, 220 to 250 million should be the buildup as we see it as of now.
On achieving progress on that, is this an issue of manpower at the agencies? I mean, are people reporting to work and starting to do, just because, I mean, I know you're providing the guidance. The issue is, I mean, how long would it take to be able to normalize and be able to provide actual information in terms of what are the accounts payable and how are the flow of payments?
Yeah, thank you. I kind of want to add what Aurelio was saying also. You know, Hacienda has contracted Deloitte and BDO to be in those agencies and try to get all that, you know, try to move the ball forward as soon as possible. So I kind of want to add that we have, you know, advisors, both BDO and Deloitte working on that stream, on that work stream.
So when do you expect to be able to reach, I mean, because we're about almost half a year of this fiscal year. I mean, when do you expect that you will be able to achieve that normalization with whatever additional resources you're putting to work on this?
I think we expect to have, you know, this completion of that specific AP work stream by Q3 2018, fiscal year 2018.
Assuming, obviously, that the reconnection of electric services, there's a lot of, for example, in the educational department, a lot of schools are still without electricity. Those invoices, obviously, getting them into the system. But as Jerry mentioned, Hacienda has contracted with BDO, and we're trying to hit all of those areas directly to try to centralize or somehow expedite that processing, because electricity is obviously a little bit unreliable, and system connectivity also. So,
Mr. Chairman, can I add to what the presenters are speaking? And I think it's to provide some more, to be more responsive, at least from a government-wide perspective, to Mr. Garcia's question. We have to accept something. And it's a problem that the government has had for many, many years. Invoicing and accounting in the government of Puerto Rico has been using a myriad of software. They're not interconnected. There's manual processes that are conducted that don't integrate seamlessly into that process, and we keep facing into this issue where we have stacks of invoices that don't get processed. The truth of the matter is we all know these solutions. I think both on the side of the government and on the side of this board, it will require a substantial investment in upgrading our software. It will require a substantial investment in training our employees and making sure that those employees continue throughout the years improving their capabilities. You mentioned manpower. Indeed, Treasury has everybody in Deloitte and everybody in BDO in Puerto Rico hired, and it's still not solving the issue. So it's clearly an issue of capability as well, and our responsibility as a government has to be to solve this issue, this software issue, this interconnectivity issue within this fiscal year or this next calendar year, because otherwise we will not reach the expectations of having a transparent and robust financial system. It will require, however, a substantial investment of funds, and in that degree, we will require support from the board from beginning to the end to make sure that it's a very that it is an effective reform and that we do not fall into the pitfalls of the past, namely that upgrades are made but that are never actually implemented at the system level and in the personnel level. And in that degree, I think there are people on this board and in the executive staff of this board that can provide that assistance as well.
Any additional questions?
Go ahead.
I appreciate that, and I understand that things are easier when one has the latest automated systems and when systems talk to each other. But I think, just speaking for myself, I think this issue of not having things recorded, this issue of not having things properly recorded, of not having a clear sense of where things are relative to, to APs, and the continued issue of delays in payments at the same time that we are looking at what's happening economically in Puerto Rico, and at the same time that you have significant balances, is frustrating. I come at it from a place of, having, worked in environments where the IT systems were from the 1970s. And I hear you that it's easier when it's all automated and it's all, perfectly talks to each other. But we can't wait until it's in that position to be able to have a real handle on what's going on, have invoices properly recorded. I mean, I appreciate the work that you're doing relative to getting on top of the top 20 departments, because that's going to be where the bulk of the money is. But not having, I think it's at least the fourth time that we've had a similar discussion. And if we're going to wait until we have the perfect systems in place to understand this, I don't, that will likely exceed the tenure of us as a board, and it's not acceptable. It's having real-time information on and having invoices recorded, having a real sense of where we are on AP, and catching up on payments for vendors who are continuing to, deliver services is critical.
Anna, I fully agree with that. We do not want it to be we do not want to implement those changes after the tenure of members of this board expires. As I mentioned, we're talking about this fiscal year or this next calendar year. Easier, but I'm sorry, but easier said than done. Easier said than done. There's no situation, I'm sorry, there's nobody can say that there's been a situation like this outside. And it's not that they're not recorded. They're literally recorded manually. Then when you're speaking about a manual process, it is indeed a personnel and manpower issue. And then you have in one calendar year, you have to prepare a fiscal plan. Then you had to prepare the implementation plans. Then you had to prepare the budget plans. Then you had the reporting requirements. And then you add to that the hurricane. And now we have to revise the fiscal plan. And then we're going to revise the budgets. Indeed, you have the same fiscal people having to do task after task. Yes, that is going to delay the process. And when I then say to this board, we recognize the problem, and I actually say, and we are going to need your help, it should not be then that extension of a hand should not be slapped away with saying unacceptable. We all know what the problem is. And the solution cannot simply be go deal with it. We're saying it needs a substantial investment of funds into an integrated system, and it needs more manpower. And we can work on that together and move forward, and based on a common set of principles, or we can just harangue each other over it. But that is the truth of the matter. It's a manpower issue when you have a manual system, and we need to then have manpower that is increasingly becoming more scarce.
So I think and I come at this from a place of wanting to, productively engage and not coming to it from a place of, a solution that is saying that we're going to truly know where we are when we have an automated solution is not realistic on the basis of what you just mentioned. So I guess the question for me is, what is the timeline that you will meet that will, give us a concrete answer on exactly where we are on APs, where the invoices are going to be recorded in a timely manner, where we're really going to know the delta that we're dealing with. And I think the challenge I have, Jerry, with the answer of, well, by Q3 we are going to be done with our processes without the granularity that tells me, are we going to have everything recorded? As Aurelio said, you don't know what you don't know. And until things are properly recorded, manually, etched in stone, or whatever the case might be, we're not going to have a real handle on this question.
And that's a good point, Ana. I just wanted to say that, when we entered when this administration entered office, there were no visibility on accounts payable. What we have done with limited resources, we have made, obviously made consistent progress. First, we have control on AP and Hacienda system. We have control of AP recorded at agency level system. Cross-checks and controls that agency allows, of the top 20 agencies, we have visibility over those. We're making progress in the missing but not recorded invoices. So, it takes time, but we've been working continuously, to get that 100% visibility on accounts payable. I mean, you want to add something else?
Yes. Because of that progress, we're in a capacity to present on a weekly basis what we have called known obligations, which is a cross-check analysis that we do across 17 agencies of everything from encumbers until vouchers and invoices, and we do a extrapolation of what's missing on or non-recorded but identified. There's an increasing number of invoices that are identified and not yet recorded by this effort that the government is doing. So, I mean, when we speak about progress, 6 months ago, there was no capacity to monitor any known obligation comprehensively. Now we're producing a periodic weekly report on that. Will need to be improved? Yes, materially. But at this point, it gives us a good approximation on trends. Second, a year ago or 3 quarters ago, I would have not been in a capacity to say how much AP's buildup we believe was reasonable year to date. At this point, I can answer a question. I might be right or wrong, but I have a reasonable degree of accuracy on that range of 220 to 250, because we're monitoring that against supplier payments. The deadline to March, I think it's, to make it very clear, is so that we have the process enhanced and the capability at the agency to record manually. It's not going to be the result of a new system. There's no way that is going to happen. We might be in some implementation of the system by March. But right now, there's a lot of progress that has been made and that will continue just by enforcing the process. It's process enforcement right now. And yes, there are limits in the resources, and there's investment being put in, temporary help by BDO and Deloitte and whoever. And it's insufficient, but we're going to focus on, so just to be as specific as possible. From now until March, what we should expect is that for those 17 agencies or 20 agencies that represent a material part of the AP potential generation, we're going to have the processes in place, and we're going to have a capacity to report on a periodic basis the nature and the flow and the size of those accounts payable. That's what we're going to be able to do, not a lot more than that. But I think that will be a material step forward.
I have one observation and then one question. I mean, one observation is, I mean, I understand the lack of resources, but my suggestion would be, if you're focusing on the process, I agree, changing the systems is not going to be the solution. It's having a robust process. Second of all, instead of spending so much money on consultants, spend money and invest money on training our public employees so they can do those functions. I would like to understand, I mean, how much of that is being done, because it's great to be able to throw resources from Deloitte or whoever you want to, and you might get a short-term result in getting the information, but you need to establish a process so these agencies learn what is the process and they can follow the process and we can have that accountability. And I haven't heard about it. I don't know if it's been done, but I would like to see that part of that money, because if I recall correctly, there were $25 million that were approved on the budget to deal specifically with this issue. So what has been done with those $25 million and how much of that is going to training to the public employees that are doing the actual functions and should be doing those functions moving forward?
I think we can provide a report on what has been accomplished, but perhaps I wasn't clear enough in my prior commentary where I tried to stress the capacity at the agency. And that means that the agency needs to be self-sufficient, and for that, their teams need to have training and capacity to, follow the standard accounting and processes. So that is an integral part. And by the way, that is one of the reasons why we don't see immediate result, because that's a progressive incorporation of capability through training and through going through the process. But, it's an embedded part of it. When we're talking about improving the process, Mr. Garcia, it has to be there. It has to be building the capability at the agency level to deal with it on an ongoing basis.
But part of the mission of the BDO and Deloitte teams that are sent to the agencies in part includes, or should include, the training of the career personnel in some of these finance divisions. So that speaks also to that point.
And then I have one final question, which was an unanswered question from the prior board meeting, which the question was, have you been able to get a census and understand how many public employees are reporting to work in all the different agencies? Do you have that information available?
Sure. There's approximately 140,000 employees, according to OMB statistics as of October. But before then, I wanted to give you a preface on what has happened after Hurricane Maria passed. On September 26, 3 days after Maria hit Puerto Rico, Chief of Staff order for Fortaleza, Chief order employees to report to duty so government could resume operations. However, many government buildings, as you may know, were destroyed. And all government agencies were able to resume their operations immediately. So the Chief of Staff, Mr. Villafañe, instructed to those employees that could not go to their government agencies to resume operations to work on all the recovery efforts for Hurricane Maria. On October 16th, a special memorandum was issued by Chief of Staff in the government in Fortaleza, 4317, which made the employee, if the employee was absent after October 2nd, it would be charged against vacation leave. On November 15th, there was another special memorandum, 4717, which ordered all government agencies to submit on a weekly basis standardized attendance report. So from then on, OMB has reported approximately 140,000 employees as of October 2017, and over more than 60%. We're working towards that number you asked, Carlos. Well, more than 60% of those agencies have reported. So we're still working on that number specifically. I don't know if, Christian, you want to?
Yes, from the samples that we've been receiving for November, Overall, you had between 75 and 85% attendance. The balance was either in vacation or special licenses that are being executed for certain employees. That leaves out the Department of Education, where in that sample you had a much lower rate at about 60-some%, and it was based mostly through November to having schools that were still closed, or that employees that were exercising their either vacation or different licenses. I'm sure that the report itself can be presented by FOMB to the oversight board. Now, what we have specifically instructed every agency head is that any unaccounted for employee that doesn't show for work, the agency should commence administrative procedures for abandoning of the workplace. And that is critical going forward. So those are the percentages, at least, that I have from my recent report, and I'm sure that FOMB can provide the actual report after this meeting.
If I may, taking on the offer of Mr. Sobrino, I would like to request formally that we send a letter requesting for that report and to obtain that report, if possible, on a weekly basis. And the same thing in terms of accounts payable, which I think are two areas which are really critical to the oversight of this board. And we would like to formally start obtaining that information.
Mr. Chairman, I would add that I would endorse that request.
Fantastic. But then it's endorsed by unanimity.
I'd add to that request that I think we need to get the specifics on the plan for getting implementation of the manual systems for recording invoices and understanding the full balance of AP. And what the interim steps are going to be, how you're rolling, which agencies, and we need more granularity on the AP plan that will be adhered to.
So noted. Does anybody have any additional questions for the FOMB team?
If I could ask, this is a general question, Mr. Patello, kind of following up a little bit on Mr. Garcia's question. I've mostly dealt with government at the federal level, the state level. I've never seen a government that is so dependent upon outside consultants for things, such as producing the sort of figures that you're doing today. I know this is entirely a situation you've inherited. I'm not speaking poorly at all, either of you or the consultants you work with. Can you describe the historical situation in which government agencies themselves are not able to produce these kinds of figures, and so you become reliant upon outside consultants? Because it's something that's just unusual in any other government that I've worked with. I mean, in the sense of you're speaking of training and implementing.
You mean specific agencies, or is that I'm not understanding
well,
too well?
You're speaking, say, we need to upgrade our software. We need to train employees so that they can process, whether it's receipts or data. And I've just never been familiar with those kinds of problems in government before.
I think we could all we could speak is essentially anecdotal, because I don't think anybody has conducted an academic study on this. I do not know what was the experience of, for example, Mr. Garcia when he came in to the government in 2009. I can tell you, at least from our experience, when we walked into the government in January, there were complete operations that had been outsourced completely. For example, in OMB, the preparation of a budget hadn't been done there for a couple of years. In the bank, we had officials that had also, they were conducting their routinary work, but the more strategic or planning aspect of how the agency should look forward or advance forward, that wasn't conducted either in-house. It was conducted through consultants. Unfortunately, it is anecdotal, but I think that eventually somebody should look into what has been the issue, because we have all realized that we have good employees, but typically they weren't given the responsibilities, or they weren't given the accountability to take over very critical or strategic tasks. But again, this is more anecdotal experience. I don't know what Mr. Garcia saw when he was in the government in 2009. I can tell you what we saw when we came in January.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
If I may add my 20 cents, and I'm an advisor, so you can take this as my most honest view on it, but being an advisor outside of the government. In my life as an advisor, and I have 17 years doing restructuring work, I have never been in any single entity that hasn't maintained working capital ledgers on a live system. The first time I landed in Puerto Rico, I noticed that, and that is something across all government agencies, not one, all of them. It was hard for me to explain to my colleagues the situation that we were seeing. No AP ledgers maintenance on an ongoing basis, except for those APs that were ready to be paid. So when you tackle a situation like that, you need to create a process. You need to produce a process. And in my opinion, that effort is a genuine and real effort that the government is undertaking since, I would say, I don't know, February or March this year. And it is unrealistic, in my personal, humble opinion, to believe that you will get from 0 to 100. You need to go through a process of implementation, and you need to go through a process of prioritization. And that's the effort that it's being carried out. And there's progress that it's, being seen consistently. We're not there, but we're getting there. That's the best that I can
I appreciate that. This is very helpful. Thank you.
How long have you been a consultant for the government of Puerto Rico? You were a consultant to the previous administration.
2 years and 9 months.
And how are we doing with the ledger issue that you brought up? The issue that you just brought up with the AP ledgers, how are we doing with that?
How are we doing today?
Yes.
I think that I've never seen so much commitment from the government to really resolve that issue. I mean, we can continue discussing this for several other sessions. I don't think that will make the government more aware that this is a high priority issue.
It'll be helpful to get the reports that Mr. Garcia has asked for. I think it would be helpful in the report relative to personnel that are reporting to work to also understand, kind of are the hours standard, and how many buildings are you seeing that are still affected, and how how are you triaging, redirecting, and otherwise handling the continued employment in places where the facilities may not be at the level necessary for people to be able to show up to work.
Mr. Chair, I have one more request. I think as those reports are provided, I think those reports should be made public, as AFAS have done already with the liquidity reports, which has been very helpful, and I want to thank them that I have seen that they continue to provide that information on a weekly basis on their website. So I would say that this report should follow the same transparency protocol and be provided to the public.
Thank you. Any additional questions? All right. Thank you very much, the FOMB team. If we may, let's move on to the fifth point of today's agenda, the importance of structural reforms and the updated fiscal plan. As the Oversight Board and the Government of Puerto Rico work to revise said fiscal plan, it is crucial that we address the importance of structural reforms. We see the fiscal plan as transformational and comprehensive roadmap to balance the budget and turn around our economy. Structural reforms being key to making this happen. I would like now to invite our Executive Director, Natalie Jaresco, to present on the importance of said structural reforms in the updated fiscal plan. Natalie?
2.5 weeks from now, when the Commonwealth fiscal plan is due, and as Puerto Rico is still facing the challenges posed by Hurricane Maria, we believe it is even more important than before to create a fiscal plan that is truly transformational for the island. While fiscal measures will be crucial to this plan, there is another key set of levers the government should be looking at, and that is structural reforms, or other initiatives that can stimulate economic development and growth. Indeed, as the Puerto Rican government looks over the next 5 years, a focus on how to increase employment, improve capital productivity, and enable and support market efficiency will be crucial to establishing a foundation for the island's prosperity. Before discussing the details of how this fiscal plan should address structural reforms, it's important to highlight the principles the board is using to frame the objectives needed for a certifiable plan. This is especially important in a post-Maria environment in which there are new macroeconomic factors to consider and additional challenges to overcome. In order to certify a fiscal plan on February 2nd, the board will look for the following 9 principles to be fulfilled. First, the fiscal plan must reflect the current demographic trends, economic challenges, hurricane damage assessments, federal funding commitments, and a government, both the central government and local governments, sized to this post-hurricane reality. Second, the revised fiscal plan must cover 5 fiscal years, the first fiscal year being FY18 and concluding with fiscal year 22. Third, to properly establish an accurate assessment of the fiscal outlook, the base case scenario within the fiscal plan should reflect a variety of scenarios of federal recovery funding, including one assuming no additional federal support beyond that which is established by law. Fourth, the revised fiscal plan must provide sufficient resources to ensure appropriate immediate emergency response and recovery effort in anticipation of federal funds, including provision of public safety, healthcare, and education, in order to avoid increased outmigration, particularly by working families and working-age populations. The fiscal plan must include metrics focused on the improvement of living standards, for example, education, healthcare, and job creation. Fifth, the fiscal plan should continue to prioritize structural reforms necessary to improve the business climate, such as pension reform, corporate tax reform, and capital efficiency efforts. Sixth, based on available and dedicated resources, the capital expenditure plan must provide the basis for a long-term economic recovery plan for Puerto Rico, focusing on increased and expedited support for rebuilding critical infrastructure, such as energy, water, transportation, and housing. Seventh, the fiscal plan must include the resources to complete the fiscal year 15 Commonwealth Consolidated Audited Financial Statements by no later than December 31st, 2017, and fiscal years 16 and 17 Commonwealth Consolidated Audited Financial Statements by no later than June 30th, 2018. Thereafter, the Commonwealth Consolidated Audited Financial Statement should be issued no later than within 6 months of the fiscal year end. Number 8, structural balance should be achieved as soon as possible in any event by no later than fiscal year 22, after taking into account the period of time required for the stabilization of Puerto Rico's humanitarian crisis. And lastly, number 9, the fiscal plan must be accompanied by a long-term debt sustainability analysis, or DSA, and detailed economic projections reflecting a 30-year time period. Finally, aside from these 9 principles, the board has articulated the necessity for adopting a once-and-done philosophy, this meaning developing a comprehensive and sustainable solution for all involved entities, including a fiscal balance and debt level that creates confidence in the capital markets and therefore allows future access and avoids the replay of the situation. As you can see from these key principles, the board's aim is to craft overall a comprehensive transformation plan for the economy. In order to achieve this plan, there are 5 steps we expect the government to undertake. First, it is important to develop an understanding of the macroeconomic impacts of the hurricane, given the current data currently available. These should provide a new set of assumptions by which to project new revenue and new expenditure projections. Given the new projections, the government then needs to consider 2 major levers. First, fiscal measures to drive efficiency in government, and second, structural reforms that can help drive growth economy-wide. A final plan should incorporate these levers with an understanding of the recovery funds and reimbursement timing needed as part of its capital plan. To understand the importance of structural reforms, it's helpful to get a sense of the unique context Puerto Rico is in a post-Maria environment. It is unique in that it is facing a fiscal crisis and devastation from Hurricane Maria at the same time. Puerto Rico has been in a 10-year period of economic stagnation. When other economies have faced fiscal crises, we have seen a number of long-term impacts. After the debt crisis From 2010 to 2012, Greece saw their emigration rate double, with over half having postgraduate degrees. Puerto Rico's immigration barriers are arguably lower. Ireland witnessed major declines in property values, while in the United States, the recession led to a major drop in labor participation. Both of these are possibilities for Puerto Rico. Meanwhile, this summer, Puerto Rico had just started to attempt to implement a fiscal plan in order to regain stability when it was hit by the largest storm it faced in the last 100 years. And while we are still learning about the overall impact of the storm, there's reason to believe that without clear focus on rebuilding, the island could take the turn of Grenada, New Orleans, and or Haiti, which also saw impacts on population and core infrastructure and had long roads to eventual success. The good news is that structural reforms can play a huge role in economic recovery and can therefore potentially help reverse some of these possible negative trends. As part of a growth plan, structural reforms play a key role. When coupled with a stronger fiscal position, structural reforms can equip an economy with a strong labor force, efficient capital, and competitive market, thereby driving a stronger job market, fueling population growth, and supporting overall GNP. In effect, they can drive a virtuous circle. There are 6 core pillars that we believe the fiscal plan should consider and evaluate as part of a comprehensive plan for Puerto Rico. To increase overall employment per capita, the plan should consider implementing private sector reform, incentivizing formal employment by reforming welfare benefits and reducing the cost of employment. 2, promoting job creation and foreign direct investment, generating new jobs by attracting foreign direct investment and developing sectoral plans to promote economic development, for example, tourism. To improve capital productivity, the fiscal plan should focus on enabling capital efficiency, expediting processes to obtain permits, enable public and private investment in infrastructure for long-term growth. And 4th, reforming the power and energy sector, reducing and stabilizing the energy prices through promoting competition, resiliency, and transforming key utilities. To enable and support market efficiency, the fiscal plan should focus on 2 things: increasing market competition, which means instituting corporate tax reform and allowing more competition among businesses and more economic activity, and 2nd, improving government processes and talent, reducing transaction costs and modernizing processes to improve ease of doing business. These 6 pillars, when combined, can help drive transformational change for the Puerto Rican economy. In fact, other countries, other economies have seen success in implementing structural reforms such as these in order to improve economic outcomes. Examples abound, but a couple just to share. None are perfect, of course, but all show an example of direction. In 2010, Mexico invested $244 million to improve performance in their energy sector, modernizing equipment and substations, implementing real-time power outage monitoring, and using GIS to better prepare for potential impacts to the power grid. Through this, they decreased yearly outages from 7 hours in 2010 to 55 minutes in 2014. In an example of the Dominican Republic in 2014, they created an initiative for national productivity and competitiveness, which included legal reforms to facilitate business creation, digital platform for import-export processes, and changes in the corporate tax structure. Through this, they moved from number 80 to number 66 in the World Economic Forum's Global Competitive Index between 2013 and 17, over a period of 4 years. In Italy in 2014, the Italy's Job Act reduced recruitment costs for firms, added conditionalities for unemployment, created tax deductions to promote the employment of women, and lessened stringent employment protections. As a result, it is predicted this will add 2.4% to Italy's GDP over 10 years, as part of a total reform package that is expected to add 6% to GDP over the 10 years. Closer by, after Katrina in New Orleans, educational reforms were implemented that promoted school choice and eliminated attendance zones for schools. As a result of these and other efforts, graduation rates rose from 54% in 2004 to 73% in 2015. In my experience in Ukraine, we embarked on major reforms in the procurement process. We mandated the use of an electronic system, made government officials disclose financial conflicts of interest, and promoted the use of open data in procurement. By doing so, Ukraine increased the number of unique suppliers that they had access to the system by 300%. And lastly, as an example, in Mauritius, They implemented sweeping property reforms, digitizing land records, reducing fees and charges related to property registration, and eliminating the property transfer tax. Through these changes, registration time for properties dropped from 210 days to just 14. Again, these are all just examples of single individual structural reforms which promote economic development and growth. And as the government crafts its plan to transform the Puerto Rican economy and restore fiscal balance and prosperity to the island, we hope they couple fiscal measures with structural reforms to truly drive change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Esco. Now I would like to turn to the board's recent activities in connection with the ongoing revisions to the Commonwealth fiscal plans, as well as the fiscal plans of a number of instrumentalities. As you may be aware, the board has held 3 listening sessions to obtain input from stakeholders regarding many of the aspects that will affect the fiscal plan revision process. I will now ask our executive director to update us on these sessions.
Thank you, Chairman Carrion. In our 10th public board meeting on October 31st, we outlined the revision process for the fiscal plans. And as part of this revision process, we organized 3 listening sessions over the last month, 1 on macro and demographic trends, 1 on fiscal measures, and 1 on capital investment and labor reforms. The first 2 sessions were held in San Juan, and the third was held here in New York City yesterday. We are grateful to have received a diverse range of perspectives from a variety of experts comprising academics, former and current public sector officials, representatives of the private sector, and the social sector. I would like to provide a brief summary of each of these 3 listening sessions. The first listening session was focused on macroeconomic and demographic trends. And I think it was clear from this session that we can expect to see significant decline in GNP in fiscal year 18, with some recovery beginning in fiscal year 19. That said, the outlook beyond that is much less certain. For example, one study of 6,000 storms done by Professor Amir Jinnah from the Climate Lab suggests that the effects on economic growth after a hurricane typically last 15 years. Of course, Hurricane Maria had an outsized impact, and the long-term economic effects are difficult to anticipate. Another key topic was the need to understand not just the quantity, but also the composition and characteristics of individuals departing the island. For example, which skill sets will be leaving with those who leave the island, along with the factors that might draw them back to the island over time. The second listening session was focused on tax policy, government efficiency, and education and healthcare. There was broad consensus that there is a need for comprehensive simplification of the existing tax regime on the island across all types of taxes, not just involving individual income taxes. We also talked about the huge potential for improving government efficiency through privatization, digitization, and greater use of the nonprofit sector to deliver social services. For example, Olga Ramos from the Boys and Girls Club of Puerto Rico talked about how her organization helps children between the ages of 6 and 18 via after-school programs. There was also much discussion on education, such as the need to increase emphasis on applied research at the local universities, as well as the importance of performance management, as highlighted by Secretary of Education Kelleher, who shared some of the metrics currently being used to track student outcomes and school performance. The third and last listening session yesterday focused on capital investment and labor reforms. On the topic of capital investment, we discussed the importance of addressing the manufacturing sector, as well as identifying target sectors that Puerto Rico should focus on, such as tourism, agriculture, manufacturing, and finance, in light of its inherent strengths such as its skilled workforce, strategic location, and natural resources. On the topic of labor reforms, many of the panelists highlighted the need to go beyond budget cuts and leverage structural reforms to reverse Puerto Rico's economic decline. One of our panelists, Desmond Lachman from the American Enterprise Institute, even called for an IMF-style structural plan of adjustment comprised of budget cuts, structural reforms, and debt relief. In each of these 3 sessions, we also had time dedicated to members of the public to share their testimony with regards to the fiscal plan redevelopment process. The Oversight Board is very grateful to all the panelists for their time, their perspectives. We learned a great deal. These 3 listening sessions have provided us with extremely valuable inputs as we move forward to revise the fiscal plans. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Esco. Would any members of the board like to ask of Mr. Esco any questions regarding the way forward on structural reforms or the listening sessions that we undertook recently. No, they're being, I'm sorry.
What's, any kind of insights to date in terms of, thinking around in terms of the extent to which what we expect to see with the government should align with the kind of comprehensive structural reform plan that and things that we can do to increase the chances that what we get is really a transformative plan that is looking at things that Puerto Rico can do to get the economy going.
I think our teams are working together with the team at FOMB to the extent possible. I think that the structural reforms element is probably the one that has not received as much attention as it requires. As we, on our side of the agenda, have been looking at the GNP statistics and looking at the effect of the necessary fiscal measures to close a gap, it becomes ever more important that the truly important elements are the structural reforms, and that's where the great amount of focus has to be in order to turn the curves around from an otherwise very, very difficult trend.
Is another critical element kind of a tax reform proposal that at a minimum does a tax reform plan that at a minimum does no harm to Puerto Rico's current environment and competitive advantage?
Right. I think even before looking at fiscal measures and structural reforms, the number one critical element today is the federal recovery funds, the speed and the amount, and the fact that the federal tax reform does not hurt the Puerto Rican business environment.
So,
thank you.
Mr. Esco, what would be the difference between the IMF-style structural plan that Mr. Lockman described yesterday? And I understand that you have had to deal with this type of plan in the Ukraine. What's the difference between that type of structural plan versus what we have under PROMESA?
An IMF plan comes with the underlying conditions and a calendar for specific reforms to be implemented, but in addition to that, it comes with the funding to close the balance of payments gap. So for every part of the program, there is a conditioned amount of money that will come into the economy from the IMF in that case, but not only, sometimes from third parties. In addition to the funding, it could also come together with and be structured such that the debt relief, the debt restructuring is conditional, is a condition of getting IMF funding. In other words, an IMF program looks at the whole gap, says your gap is $25 billion. To fill that gap, you have to do this much in savings and fiscal, you have to do this much in debt restructuring, and you have to do this much of raising third-party funds. And every reform would be a conditioned precedent on a very specific schedule for receipt of any of those funds.
Thank you, Natalie. Let's move on to the seventh point on the agenda, the presentation of the budget review process for fiscal year 2019. Now I would like for our Fiscal Plan and Budget Implementation Director, Miguel Tuya, to present to us the process envisioned for the review of the budget for the territory of Puerto Rico and its instrumentalities for fiscal year 2019.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We would like to discuss several key objectives for the budgeting process as part of today's meeting. As we continue to focus on ways to provide greater oversight around annual budgets and subsequent reporting on actual spending relative to the budget, the Oversight Board continues to search for a path to greater fiscal governance. In line with this view, we will discuss the Oversight's efforts to review and certify a consolidated budget for fiscal year 19, which is an expansion on the review and certification of the Commonwealth's General Fund budget done on fiscal year 18. We then want to discuss the principles underlying the budget review process that will ultimately guide a consistent approach to the preparation, review, and reporting of annual budgets. We will then explain key milestones for this new budget review process and the requirements for each milestone needed by the central government, as well as central instrumentalities that also produce their own fiscal plans. These are PREPA, PRASA, University of Puerto Rico, HTA, GDB, and COSEC. Next slide. As part of the fiscal year 18 review process, the Oversight Board reviewed the consolidated budget, but just only certified the general fund, as well as a subset of public corporations' budgets. The general fund budget excludes numerous governmental funds, proprietary funds, agencies with independent treasuries, as well as government instrumentalities that ultimately rely on tax revenues or central government appropriations in order to operate. Going forward, and as part of the 19 budget review process, the Oversight Board will be certifying all elements that make up the consolidated budget. These efforts to review and certify the consolidated budget as well as the budget of a subset of public corporations that are making their own fiscal plan should improve budgetary controls, increase transparency, and enhance fiscal discipline. The review of the consolidated budget as well as regular reporting requirement post-approval of the consolidated budget will help to hold agencies accountable to their roles in fiscal governance, including FOMB, Hacienda, and FOMB. That being said, the Oversight Board is aware that there may be certain obstacles that need to be addressed to impact the feasibility of approving the entire consolidated budget and all instrumentalities budgets in the fiscal year 19. And therefore, we have started discussions with responsible parties early in order to mitigate where possible. Next slide. There are 6 principles guiding the budget review process for fiscal year 19. These principles are applicable for the full Commonwealth budget as well as for PREPA, PRASA, UPR, HTA, GDB, and COSEC. Principle number 1, all budgets must be compliant with their applicable fiscal plans and developed in accordance with modified accrual accounting standards. Principle 2, revenue forecast must be provided by the Oversight Board to the government and legislature, boards of directors where applicable, for use in developing the relevant budgets. Principle 3, budgeted expenses must be properly justified. Principle 4, reporting blueprints templates must be agreed to by the government and the Oversight Board. Government must comply with reporting pursuant to these templates. Principle 5, clear responsibility for enforcement of all elements of the budget and reporting is critical. Principle 6, all expenditures, including capital expenditures, of the Commonwealth and instrumentalities can only be made pursuant to a budget certified by the Oversight Board, COM19 and on forward. Next slide, please. Pursuant to PROMESA Section 202A, the Oversight Board will be delivering a notice to the Governor and Legislature providing a schedule for developing, submitting, approving, and certifying the budget for fiscal year 19. Pursuant to PROMESA, the following milestones are required in order to satisfy the new budget review process for fiscal year 19. Milestone 1, the Oversight Board sends the Governor a schedule for the fiscal year 19 budget review process, a copy of which will be sent after this meeting. Milestone 2, the Government of Puerto Rico provides a complete inventory listing of all agencies, corporations, and funds included in the fiscal plans. Milestone 3, the government provides proposed revenues for each agency, corporation, and fund consistent with the approved fiscal plan, along with supporting details, including all relevant third-party certifications. Milestone 4, the Oversight Board sends the Governor and the Board of Directors, where applicable, the forecast or a revenue forecast for the period covered by all applicable budgets. Milestone 5, the government and appropriate governing boards provide proposed budgets by fund or by department to the Oversight Board, along with supporting details, including detailed reconciliation of budgeted expenses to revenues, and supporting details to evidence consistency with historical actual expenditures and/or explanations if there is a significant difference. The government as well also provides proposed reporting blueprints for reporting post-certification. This will need to be reviewed and agreed to prior to budget approval. Milestone 6, the Oversight Board provides fiscal year 19 general fund budget to the legislature, and the Oversight Board approves reporting blueprints for each fund type. The reporting blueprints will include templates to be used going forward and identification of expected timing for reporting actual relatives to budget. Milestone 7, the Oversight Board approves all budgets for fiscal year 19. The new budget review process for fiscal year 19 for PREPA and PRASA will follow the same timeline as the central government regarding key milestones. The new budget review process for fiscal year 19 for Senate and other instrumentalities will follow a separate set of dates regarding the same key milestones. These dates will be consistent with their revised fiscal plan milestones and timelines. The instrumentalities I'm referring to are University of Puerto Rico, HTA, GDP, and COSEC. Next steps here on until the approval of the budgets include ongoing dialogue with government and instrumentalities to ensure they are on track to meet milestones articulated today, both relating to the preparation of the budgets as well as the reporting templates. Further, the Oversight Board will continue to have discussions on best practices that the government should consider incorporating as part of the fiscal year 19 budget. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tuya. Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Tuya? No? Okay. Let's move on to, thank you, Mr. Tuya. Let's move on to the 8th point, presentation and approval of our debt review policy. I would like to ask,
may I make a recommendations to the principles that Mr. Tuya delineated?
you may make a recommendation.
We would recommend that the principles and the calendar that have been presented by Mr. Tuya expressly incorporate Section 204D of PROMISA to make sure that this process is in line with the federal program requirements that the government is subject to, and that we do not, in this budget process, somehow inadvertently impede the government's compliance with its federal programs.
We shall have General Counsel review said proposal and get back to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now we can move on to the presentation of the and approval of the debt review policy. I would like to ask for our Executive Director, Mr. Esco, to describe said policy that is proposed to be adopted by the Board. By way of background, I should note that Section 207 of the law requires prior Oversight Board approval of the territorial government, which includes the Commonwealth and any of its covered instrumentalities, issuing debt or guaranteeing, exchanging, modifying, repurchasing, redeeming, or entering into similar transactions with respect to its debt. Mr. Esco.
Thank you, Mr. Carrion. Section 207, as you said, of PROMESA provides that the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico and its instrumentalities cannot, without the prior approval of the Oversight Board, issue debt or guarantee, exchange, modify, repurchase, redeem, or enter into similar transactions with respect to its debt. This applies to all covered entities, not just those in Title III. The purpose is to ensure the terms, conditions, amounts, and uses are in the best interest of the entity and in the best interest of Puerto Rico. This debt review process also helps the Board to ensure that the island's overall debt restructuring is done in a fashion that ensures a quick and effective return to capital markets. At the November 18, 2016 Board meeting, the Board proposed and adopted a procedure for reviewing all debt transactions. That procedure provided for a 15-day review period by the Board of any debt transactions proposed to be entered into by a covered entity, and required that the government submit several documents to the Board so that the Board could determine whether to approve the proposed transaction. In the last year, Since that policy was put in place, the board has reviewed and approved multiple debt transactions pursuant to Section 207, and from that experience has decided to modify the process from the one proposed and adopted on November 18th, 2016, and to formalize the revised process in a formal debt review policy. The policy going forward is proposed as follows. No debt transaction shall be valid and enforceable if not approved in writing in advance by the Oversight Board. To determine whether a debt transaction should be approved under Section 207 of PROMESA, the Oversight Board will consider the amount, terms and conditions, anticipated use of funds, purpose of the transaction, impact on applicable fiscal plans and budgets, any alternative transactions, and any other relevant factors. Each debt transaction must be advisable for the entity entering into it and for Puerto Rico as a whole. Within 7 business days of receipt of a proposed debt transaction and the required supporting documentation, the Oversight Board will respond either approving the transaction, approving with conditions, requiring further review, or denying the transaction. The Oversight Board looks forward to working hand in hand with the government of Puerto Rico to ensure all debt transactions occur in the best interest of Puerto Rico. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Esco. Do we have any questions from the members of the board regarding this policy we're about to adopt?
I have a question, Mr. Chair, or question/comment. I understand some of the changes that are being made in this policy. I'd like to make sure that we understand, that the concern I think with the change is ensuring that we are seeing every request that we should be seeing, that there aren't obligations that are being entered into that would require 207 approval that are not being reviewed. So I just would like to make sure that we stay on that issue and that that you take a look at whether there's anything else we need to be doing to ensure that we are being noticed of everything that should be subject to 207 and that there are not obligations that are being entered into that require board approval that we're not being noticed of.
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional comments or questions?
I have a question.
Proceed.
Has the board in the policy, I was reviewing the policy, I didn't see an exact definition of what a debt transaction is. So for example, would financial leases be included in this? Or what type of, are we speaking of scope? Because when you read section 207, it is directed towards public debt or financial debt. Have we, and I think it goes to what Ms. Mato Santos was speaking, have we delineated what type of debt transaction we're actually scoping within 207?
Could you?
Good question. Yeah. I don't have any information beyond what's in the statute. So the definition that I used for this policy is what's in the statute. We can look into it based on Ms. Mato Santos' request as to whether it's properly defined, broadly enough defined, understandably defined, but right now all we've used is what's in the statute.
Okay.
Very good.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to move to adopt the policy for the review and approval of contracts we've just been talking about pursuant to Section 207 of PROMESA, a copy of which we will post.
Would anybody second that motion?
I'd second the motion.
I'd like to ask for a voice vote. Those in favor, please say yes.
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 All members having voted in favor of the motion is approved. Now let's move on, if we may, to the 9th point in today's agenda, the revisions to the Code of Conduct of the Board. As you recall, at our last public meeting, our ex officio member, Mr. Sobrino, offered a resolution to address conflict of interest concerns arising from the contract review policy adopted at that meeting by the Board. After serious consideration of Mr. Sobrino's proposal and consultation with our ethics advisor, Ms. Andrea Bonin-Blanc, we would like her to review for us certain proposed changes to our Code of Conduct. In line with Mr. Sobrino's proposals, the majority of the changes revolve around the heightened need for conflict of interest awareness and analysis because of the Board's new responsibilities in reviewing contracts. Welcome, Andrea Bonin-Blanc.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and board members. I'm Andrea Bonin-Blanc, and I was appointed independent ethics advisor to this board back in March of this year. And prior to that, the Code of Conduct was first adopted and approved by this board in January of this year. So the code, as is, was pretty complete, but the recommendations that we received from Mr. Sobrino were very important, and we considered them and also incorporated them in this first revision to the code. The one thing I'd like to mention as well is that the code is a living, breathing document, so if there are changes that are needed from time to time, that's part of the responsibility that I have to help the board with its ethical obligations and transparency. So what I would just like to give you is the 4 big principles of changes that we've made to this version of the code, and then I can go into some detail should there be interest in that. To begin with, covered persons, meaning the people to whom this Code of Conduct applies, used to be board members, as well as the ex officio board member. We have now expanded that definition to include all staff members, so not just the board and the senior executives, but everyone on the staff. So the Code of Conduct applies to them, and they are covered persons. Secondly, and most importantly, the conflict of interest piece of the Code of Conduct has been changed substantially to reflect some of the concerns that Mr. Sobrino brought up, and there is where we have incorporated under Section 2 of this Code of Conduct some major additional responsibilities on the part of the board members and the covered persons in general to speak up about any apparent or potential or actual conflicts of interest that each individual member of the board and the staff might have with any contracts that come in the door that are now subject to the new contract review policy that the FOMB has adopted recently. And so there it's very expansive. It basically says that any covered person, their spouse, children, partners, organizations they serve as officers or directors, trustees, general partners, employees, or any other person or organization with whom he or she is negotiating or has an arrangement concerning prospective employment and may have a financial interest. All of those scenarios are subject now to this conflict of interest declaration. And what we've also done, a third major principle that we've incorporated into the Code of Conduct this time, is a proactive responsibility to come forward. It used to say that you couldn't have conflicts of interest. Now we're basically weaving in language throughout the new revision of the code that says that each covered person has a proactive responsibility to come forward to me as ethics advisor to discuss these issues prior to them being a problem or becoming an issue if they're just a potential conflict of interest. So we're trying to create a much more proactive responsibility to do that. I will comment that board members have been very good about being proactive already, but I think that putting it in the Code of Conduct and expanding it to the covered members is very important. Another very important and final principle that I think is, again, incorporated in several small revisions to this code including the ethics advisor as part of the reporting. So if there are reports or issues that need to come to the attention of the board, of the chairman of the board, as outlined already in the code, I should also be copied and or be an alternative recipient of a report of a concern. As some of you or all of you know, certainly on the staff and the board, there are anti-retaliation procedures also within the code. So we're trying to create a more robust reporting set of responsibilities as well in the code. So those are the most important changes that we've made to this code. If there are any other questions, one more thing I do want to mention is that we've also expanded this to include potential conflicts of interest from third-party vendors and contractors. So we're trying to expand the whole concept of conflicts of interest to all the important stakeholders, internal and external. So with that said, I'm happy to take any questions or comments if you have them.
Thank you, Andrea. Does anybody have any questions for Andrea?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, I would like to open by saying that my experience with Andrea has been incredibly professional and has been excellent, and to the same degree that I am willing to point out when I think that the board has fallen short, I have to say that in the case of Andrea, her performance regarding advising me on ethical issues has been stellar. And I take the revisions to the code of conduct. I see that the recommendations that I had made in the past board meeting were taken very seriously and were addressed carefully by Andrea and the rest of and those members of the board or the executive staff that considered them. I have one question regarding one of the points of the resolution I proposed, and I would like to have your thoughts on that. One of the points behind, one of the premises of the motion that I presented during the last public meeting was that, contrary to the executive staff or to myself, that I'm a full-time public employee, members on the board are part-time. They are not fully engaged in the board activities. And that is, and we saw that as a possible issue when it came to the issue of promotion of contracts. When I see the language in the code of conduct, it specifically indicates that any board member that has one of the defined conflicts of interest would be required to bring that matter to the ethics advisor if a contract were being presented for review to the board. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. In the case that there is not a defined conflict of interest, such as if there's an employee, a board's family member or business interest related to that contract, so it's not a defined conflict of interest, would a board member be prohibited under the code of conduct from promoting the interest of that contract, or is it covered in another amendment to the code of conduct?
I think your issue is addressed under Section 2, conflicts of interest, A2i, which basically says that matters concerning any contract proposed to be entered into by the government of Puerto Rico, for which a covered person might have, and then you outline all the different family members and partners and so on and so forth, may have a conflict of interest. They need to reveal that and recuse themselves. So the only way out for the board member would be to ask for a waiver, a written waiver from me, which I wouldn't give if there's a serious issue there, obviously. So I don't know if I'm addressing exactly what your point is, but I think it's incorporated into that to a certain extent. The other piece of the puzzle is if there are other contracts that may have nothing to do with the government of Puerto Rico, but are contracts where it's a business transaction, perhaps. Those kinds of things have already been brought to my attention from time to time, should there be a potential conflict. And so we've tried to resolve them on the ground, real time, in that manner. Now, I rely, of course, on board members bring these things to my attention. I don't have radar that allows me to see everything. So it's always dependent on information flowing to me in one way or another so that I can do the analysis.
So Andrea, would you agree with me that even where express conflicts of interest are not listed in the code of conduct, it would be improper for any board member to promote a specific contractual interest given the breadth and power that the board has over the approval process?
When you say contractual interest, do you mean a private transaction, or do you mean something that involves the actual FOMB or the government of Puerto Rico?
The government of Puerto Rico, a contracting interest with the government of Puerto Rico. And I'm referring to requirements that exist currently under the Puerto Rico ethics law and the Puerto Rico Contractors Code of Ethics. Mm-hmm. And again, I am trying to avoid any questioning that a contract that is presented for approval to the board had any prior promotion from the board, and that is something that we should avoid. I think it would be correct for the board to avoid any type of questioning of that matter. So that's why I'm asking, do you think it would be, I think we all agree that it would be improper for any board member to promote a contracting interest with the government of Puerto Rico, even in cases where an express conflict of interest is not listed in the Code of Conduct?
Well, the Code of Conduct doesn't list anything, but creates a framework. So everything is very fact-specific. I agree with you that a proactive promotion by a board member of a contract with either FOMB or the government of Puerto Rico would be improper. And then there are additional situations where it's a private transaction that might have an impact, an outsized impact on that person's financial, situation, or that would affect the ability of the counterparty to do business in Puerto Rico. And that's where the financial disclosures that we have in place that are federally mandated come in. So you have the quarterly reports and the annual report that needs to be made. And in those reports, we have detailed financial statements made by each board member, as all of you know, where we dig deeper when we see a connection to Puerto Rico. So if there's I'll use one example, a large corporation that has a potential business or business in Puerto Rico, has labor issues, has tax issues, and so on. If you're holding the stock of that company, it might be a problem. So everything is very fact-specific, and you have to look at it, and that's why I think what we're trying to incorporate in this code is a proactive stance on the part of the covered persons, meaning board and staff, to just consult before doing something, or if something presents itself unbeknownst to them that it might be a conflict.
Thank you, Andrea. I would like, even though I do not vote for the amendments to the Code of Conduct, I would like to say that I appreciate them and I endorse them. And I also think that Andrea's comments of what would be proper and improper will be taken. I trust they will be taken to heart by everybody on this board and the executive staff. So thank you for that process.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to move adoption of the revisions to the Code of Conduct.
Mr. Chair, I second that motion.
May I have a voice vote, please? Those in favor say yes. Yes. All members having voted in favor of the motion is approved. Let's move on to the 10th topic on today's agenda, update on the contract review and approval process. The board, at its last public meeting, adopted a policy to review contracts entered into by the government and its instrumentalities under PROMESA Section 204B2. Our executive director will now give us an update regarding the status of the reviews and actions taken under the policy.
Thank you, Chairman Carrion. As you said, during the 10th and last previous public board meeting on October 31st, the Oversight Board presented and approved a contract review policy. Pursuant to Section 204B2 of PROMESA, the Oversight Board requires approval of certain contracts to assure that they, quote, promote market competition and are not inconsistent with the approved fiscal plan, unquote. I want to briefly present a status update of our contract review process. As of December 4th, the Oversight Board has received 11 contracts that were entered into after the effective date of the contract review policy. We have issued a response entitled Observations, Feedback Not Required to 10 out of those 11 contracts and are in the process of reviewing the 11th one. The aggregate value of those 11 contracts is $496 million, of which $416 million relates to healthcare services contracts and $80 million relates to debris removal and management contracts. The Oversight Board has also requested documentation for the Whitefish and Cobra contracts that PREPA entered into prior to the effective date of the contract review policy. We have issued an observations, feedback required response for the Whitefish contract, and we've received preliminary information from PREPA about the Cobra contract late last Friday. These two contracts have an aggregate value of $500 million.
Thank you, Mr. Esco. Now we have any questions for regarding this policy from members of the board? There being no questions from the members of the board, now let's move to the section on public comment. I'd like to remind anybody who's interested in making a comment that we have up to 3 minutes to express your view. Any person that is may be interested, please stand up and I will recognize you, and Jose Luis will bring you a microphone. Please state your full name and your affiliation if you have one, and speak as clearly as possible. Thank you. Does anybody have any comments? Going once? Very good. Thank you. Since we have no other matters to cover, I move that we adjourn this meeting.
I
second that motion.
I'd like to ask for a voice vote. Those in favor, please say yes.
Yes.
Yes. All members having voted in favor, the meeting is now adjourned at 11:05 a.m. Thank you very much for being here today.
I just sent you something. You need a change? Sí, eso.
Like a rocky start. I got my tie. I really like it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you for giving us the seven.
Sure, sure.
So we will now begin the press conference. I will ask the rest of the audience, please, so we can allow members of the press to have a conversation with the board. So we're ready to take questions as soon as you are. Questions? Deb Wire.
Thanks. I wanted to clarify one thing during Portela's talk. He mentioned that if there were not solutions come up with for PREPA and PRASA to meet the minimum funding amounts, that might put pressure on the Treasury single account. Am I understanding that there might be some money moving that way? Is that allowable by the board?
I have to be frank with you, that's a question for Mr. Portela. I haven't heard about such a transaction. I would expect that they'd consult with the board, of course.
Questions? Yeah.
From the lending from the TSA to PREPA or PRASA in the case that CDL monies were not achieved in a sufficient time period.
I'm sorry, we didn't hear that.
They're having a press conference right after us.
Yes, yes.
You're in luck.
We have another question.
Hi, I'm Alexandra Starr with New York Public Radio. So my question is, given the legislation that recently passed the House and the Senate, did the board try to change proposals that negatively impacted Puerto Rico? And if so, were there certain entities that you contracted with, and whom did you try to speak with?
I can tell you that I spoke directly to the Speaker's office. Another member of the board was present during that conversation, Mr. Garcia, and we expressed our concern about the legislation and its potential impact on Puerto Rico. And we asked what, if any, the leadership had, plans the leadership had to address the concerns that we and the business community and the government in Puerto Rico have. And that was the nature of the conversation.
I have, in addition, met with a variety of people in the House and the Senate, including Peter Roscom, who's on the House committee, prior to the approval in the Senate. We talked specifically about ensuring that in committee or in whatever stage after the House had approved their version, that, again, the enterprise of Puerto Rico not be discriminated against, not be penalized by what we understand was going on in the House version, in particular with regard to sections 4303 and 4301.
We've also sent a letter to Congress regarding the significance of tax reform.
Talking to the microphone.
And the resident commissioner asked for our opinion with regards to tax reform, and we forward that as well.
All right, next question from Robert Slavin, the Bombayer.
I was hoping if one or more of you could talk about the discussions that you've been having with the government about how the fiscal plan should be revised.
Sure. I mean, it's very much based on what we described here. Right now, we've been working, our economists have been working very closely together to understand and separate out the trend line pre-hurricane from the effect, the devastating effect of the hurricane, to the effect of funds, recovery funds that may come in on GNP, and then aside from that, taking the next step in understanding the effect of fiscal measures that have to occur to close the gap. We're working very closely together with the government on trying to understand these trends, the situation that has been created by the hurricane, and then the measures that have to be taken to close the gap, and then lastly, how the federal government funds fit into that equation, because again, in Puerto Rico's situation, federal funds in the recovery and to some extent on liquidity will be critical.
Michelle Kasky from Bloomberg.
Thank you. What's the status of the debt negotiation talks with the debt of the GDB, and then also process debt, and also University of Puerto Rico?
So I have no update on the status of any of those debts in particular. Again, in all those cases, we're going through the revision of the fiscal plan process to see what the future holds for those institutions. Of course, the litigation continues apace in certain cases, and mediation continues apace for the court-ordered mediation process. But on those specific debt situations, there is no news.
I believe we have Milady Soto from Metro in Puerto Rico on the phone. Milady, do you have a question? Anybody else from Puerto Rico on the phone? Nope, I guess no. Any other questions from the folks that are here present? No? Oh, we do have, okay, perfect.
Okay. There's been reports that some senior members of the House Natural Resources Committee have talked about widening the power of the board. As far as you know, is this effort continuing? Is this something that the board endorses?
What was the word? Widening board? As I spoke when I testified on the Hill, the board is not seeking any additional authorities at this time.
If the proposed excise tax remains in the federal tax overhaul bill, or if it is in there in some sort of form and affects Puerto Rico, what is the board's, not to say Plan B, but what are some of your ideas of how Puerto Rico can adapt to this and adjust to it and deal with it?
Frankly, right now, all efforts are being focused on not having that excise, that foreign import excise tax be applied to Puerto Rico. Plan B, you know, I need to turn to my colleagues at Hacienda, at the Treasury in Puerto Rico in terms of Plan B. But right now, all efforts are on ensuring that Puerto Rican manufacturers are not destabilized or further penalized by that specific tax.
Let's try the phone line again. I believe again Miladis is connected. Miladis, are you there?
Can you repeat the question for us?
Miladis, ¿puedes repetir la pregunta y hablar un poco más despacio, por favor?
There's no translation. Translator says he can't hear. Thanks.
The question basically is if there has been talks with the resident commissioner about the federal tax reform and your views on how the conversations and the negotiations to the Congress has or have not been unified as a single voice.
Bueno, como le comenté a la otra periodista, en efecto, pues la comisionada residente nos solicitó la posición de la Junta en relación a la reforma contributiva. Se la hicimos llegar. Nosotros, aparte de esa comunicación, pues hemos conversado con, como manifestó la directora ejecutiva, con el congresista Roscom, y este servidor y señor García, pues nos comunicamos con y conversamos con el staff del presidente de la Cámara Federal para expresar nuestra preocupación sobre el trato que se contemplaba para Puerto Rico en la reforma contributiva federal, y hablamos sobre las implicaciones que tendría de no cambiarse esa posición en cuanto al plan fiscal que estamos elaborando actualmente.
We have another question from NPR.
Thank you. So the board has previously said that an access to, so that it does not have to respond to rules under the Puerto Rican Constitution about providing information on internal procedures, and that FOIA requests do not apply to the board either. So the question is, if it's not applicable under those two venues, is the transparency mostly coming through a yearly report to Congress?
Jaime, why don't you take that question?
This is working. Yes, we are not a federal agency as stated in PROMESA, and are therefore not subject to the FOIA requests. We have been very proactive whenever there is a question by any member of the public to give information. We have, as was stated during the public meeting, we have our own code of conduct. We have our bylaws, all of which, in fact, are not required by PROMESA, but the board has proactively put together a package of measures to increase its transparency. So the board has proactively done all these measures, and that's how we have handled it.
I'll just add that in addition to that annual report to Congress, we regularly testify on the Hill, providing Congress with any information they desire. These public board meetings are a part of that transparency, as is the public distribution of all documentation that comes to the board and that the board is issuing.
Any other? Mary Ellen?
Thank you. I was wondering, you guys have been able to quickly prescribe, or before the hurricane, had been able to quickly prescribe specific cuts to government agencies. And I'm wondering if, much like you were able to give a specific dollar number there, you already have a specific dollar number in mind for bondholder recoveries.
We do not.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That brings our work today to an end. Now, the government officials will also
plan should be revised.
Sorry, can you elaborate more?
Yeah, that's...
Between the government, the board, more, what things should be expanded more?
Well, the process, I think regarding the revisions of the fiscal plan, the only discussion that I feel free to comment that wasn't public was at one point there was an itinerary suggested, and we provided comments, and the board adopted those comments regarding of what's going to be the time period for revising the fiscal plan. Now, the process, I think it's pretty open under PROMESA and both what the board has said. The board has expressed some principles. They've expressed some areas of concerns, but under PROMESA, the government is responsible to provide a first draft of that fiscal plan, including measures and other reforms that the plan that the government would implement under the plan. And then you go through the process of comment by the board and eventual certification. I think that the most important part is that we all reach a common agreement on what the macroeconomic assumptions are going to be. And in that sense, board advisors and Puerto Rico advisors the government advisors for Puerto Rico have been in discussions. But that's more or less the process we have for the revising of the fiscal plan.
Mary Ellen from Debwire.
Thanks. I'm just going to repeat the question I had earlier, that as we see declining capital levels at PREPA and PROMESA, I'm wondering how much that can pressure the Treasury single account and how that process works.
Well, yes, I expressed that earlier. Remember that right now the current TSA amount of cash has pre-Maria numbers flushing out of the system, right? We're seeing downward tendencies in terms of collections, which will have a negative impact on the TSA. Moreover, relief spending, increasing relief spending will also have a downward pressure on the TSA amount. So yes, you will see Q2 numbers, and I also actually mentioned that earlier. We saw October collections down 37%. So that's, you will see that tendency, and that will obviously have a negative effect on the TSA.
Can you repeat your earlier question, because I wasn't able to hear it? Sorry, the one that Jerry was speaking to.
Yeah, I guess I'm just confused about how the process works to move money from the TSA to PREPA and PRASA if needed.
If that mechanism, I remember you were asking about some loan or something to that effect, right?
I mean, I'm not sure if it would be a loan. I don't.
The mechanism to transfer any funds from the TSA into PREPA would be a process that would require us to design a plan and then discuss that with the board, because it would require their approval. Otherwise, we would see if the CDL program can provide any type of liquidity relief to PREPA.
And to add to what Christian was saying, that's our priority. We're being in talks with Treasury and FEMA regarding the process, calendar, timing of the CDL, a possible CDL funding for PREPA. So, in the next few weeks, we'll have a more clearer picture in terms of the specific day of funding for PREPA. And that's our priority.
My question is, why are small and local bondholders not being paid back while public workers and even some possibly in Florida that aren't currently living in Puerto Rico receiving bonuses?
So I think the Christmas bonus issue that you're referring to has been misrepresented in the public discussion. There's an end-of-year payment that's been part of the Puerto Rico payroll since like the 60s. I think it was approved in 1969, if I'm not, it was Law 34 of 1969. And what it essentially provided was there was an end-of-year payment to any public employee that had worked for the government for 6 months between December 1st and November 30th of a 12-month period. That payment has been considered a regular part of the payroll since '69. It was included within the fiscal plan that was certified in March. Mm-hmm. It was included then in Act 26, also known as the Fiscal Plan Compliance Act. It carried out a reduction of that bonus. It was scored by the board. It was then included in the budget that was prepared and certified by the board. After the hurricane, we had all expressed an understanding that payroll would continue, provided people were working or were in some kind of license. And by license, I mean they decide to burn their vacation days, or are actually sick, or have some other type of license that provides for them continued payment of payroll. There was never any expression that we should not pay that end-of-year payment. It was never suggested. And when you look at the number compared to other efforts that nobody has questioned, I think it's not an issue of whether it's part of payroll. And the understanding was that we would continue doing that.
I actually wanted to add to what Christian was saying in terms of Act 26 and the implementation of the same. By putting a uniform fringe benefits for our public employees, we have saved approximately $50 million for fringe benefits in the budget. So I wanted to add to that.
Michelle from Bloomberg.
Hi, and forgive me if this was in your presentation, but we haven't been able to receive your presentation yet. But
Sure.
Do you have an estimate in terms of your projection for revenue collections for the end of the second quarter or the end of fiscal 2018 in terms of how much do you anticipate being that actual revenue collections may come in below estimates?
I think the Secretary of Treasury of Hacienda have expressed have stated that possible deficiency in collections. What we're thinking, and I don't have that figure with me right now, was the forecast for fiscal year end. However, we're seeing downward trending in collections. I think I expressed this earlier for October. Right now, it's 37% down in general collections. In terms of that specific number, I can probably get that number for you. I can't, as an Hacienda question. So.
Patrick Mohan, Reorg. I just had a question. I know in connection with the hurricanes, the Oversight Board allowed y'all to kind of shift over up to $1 billion in connection with the emergency measures. And I was just wondering if that information, or has there been a report on whether or not that shifting has taken place and how much has been shifted, just in accordance with the letter?
Well, sorry, what was the question again? I'm sorry. So I'm getting some answers.
It's from South Carolina. It also kind of does it.
It's fine.
Just the shifting, in connection with the hurricanes, the Oversight Board allowed y'all to shift up to $1 billion in your budget due to emergency measures. And I was just wondering, has there been a report as far as any amounts that have been shifted in accordance with that letter, or any kind of allocation of those amounts?
Yeah, the board approved a reallocation of up to $1 billion in budget items or to respond to emergency work. We understand that at OMB, there was an amount that was actually used. It wasn't up to $1 billion or close. It was mostly from the emergency fund, and there have been other adjustments that I know need to be made or were to be made, but I believe OMB was discussing those with Ernst & Young. If you'd like, I could give you my card and give you a follow-up of that.
Gerardo, you wanted to expand on Michelle's question.
Michelle, actually, one of my advisors texted me. We had that 37%. We've seen that 37% drop in October. We're estimating, we're forecasting a 25% down for year end. As of right now, yes, 25% down.
I wonder if there's been any a reduction or there's been a maintenance of the reporting of communicable diseases. If the health system, this is off the subject of fiscal plan in a way, but has funding for the collection of information on communicable disease and on waterborne and airborne diseases and epidemic diseases, has that funding and has that capability been maintained post-hurricane?
So post-hurricane, that concern, especially in connection with mosquitoes, was an area of great concern because we understood that we had a 2 to 3 week window when certain mosquitoes would be in season, and those and flu and other tropical diseases we would have a surge. FEMA and the Army and HHS actually assisted the government in bringing in the chemicals and the materials that were required to expand the fumigation program that the Department of Health in Puerto Rico had. Since then, we haven't seen, or at least from my understanding is we haven't seen a surge of what are typical reports. But there are other environmental concerns that the Puerto Rico Environmental Quality Board is taking very seriously, especially regarding water and the adequate disposition of dead livestock and sewage. So that work is still ongoing and would be part eventually. It's been part of the Category A and B funds that have been dispersed by FEMA or that have been somehow been used by FEMA to pay other federal stakeholders. But that type of work is going to be critical in the more permanent recovery work to make sure that we don't have to face that type of problem again, especially in parts of the island where you have agricultural projects very near to water sources.
Your water quality monitoring, to what degree has water quality returned to pre-hurricane levels, drinking water quality, and has there been any increase in waterborne disease that you could measure? And is that A and B funding taking care of that, or will that have to be covered by C to G funding?
So I can tell you one thing. I live in the San Juan metropolitan area. I drink water from the faucet. I know that the EQB, the Puerto Rico Environmental Quality Board, and PRASA have taken steps in other parts of the island where there might be concerns. There was at one point a report where people were supposedly drinking from a Superfund site that ended up not being true. Monitoring of the water quality is a joint effort between those two entities and the Department of Health. We've also requested that the EPA be involved in the process. So we've been trying we were first trying to reestablish those site visits to measure or to evaluate the quality of water, and the efforts are to continue that and eventually improve it.
We have a follow-up from...
I actually wanted to go back to your question from New York, from the $1 billion budget allocation. As of today, it's been $11 million for disaster spend through TSA. So as of right now, $11 million for disaster spend through TSA.
Follow-up from Emily.
So I do understand your point that Christmas bonuses have been a part of the budget and payroll, I think you said since 1969, is that right?
Yes.
So two parts. One, do you not think that times have changed and payroll and government right-sizing has and should change since that time? And why is it that local bondholders and retirees are the ones left to suffer? So my real question is, does this government not care about local retirees that invested their savings in Puerto Rico bonds?
I'm sorry, that's a completely ridiculous premise. It's part of the payroll system that we've had for decades. It was part of a certified fiscal plan. It was part of a certified budget. To somehow allege that continuing payroll payment is indication that we don't care about somebody is a ridiculous premise, and I'm not going to entertain it.
We have a follow-up from Mary Ellen.
Hi, I have a question regarding PREPA and the Whitefish contract. I was wondering if since FEMA will not be paying that, if Whitefish's request for money would now be part of the Title III process.
So FEMA might make an indication that it does not want to reimburse an expense. That's subject to a process and discussions between the state coordinating officer, the government's authorized representative, and FEMA going forward. If that's involved in the Title III process, they would eventually have to make some kind of petition. But other than that, we can't comment to that process.
Robert?
Just a simple follow-up to something Mr. Patella said about 5 minutes ago. He said that there's a projection of a 25% revenue shortfall by year end. And I just wondered if you could make clear whether this is by the end of the calendar year or the end of the fiscal year.
End of fiscal year.
Any other question, Michelle?
Hi, you're working on the revised fiscal plan, and in the fiscal plan that you had before the hurricanes hit, you were estimating you would have about $8 billion for debt service through 2026. And since then, everyone has said that needs to be adjusted. By how much do you anticipate that $8 billion might need to?
We can't comment to that, subject to the mediation agreement.
Correct.
But you'll still be in mediation on December 22nd.
I understand that, but we've been
over
instructed by the court to specifically not talk to that subject. It was the Judge Swain and Judge Lane were very clear on that in response to comments to that effect. So although I would love to give you our thoughts on that. I am not going to challenge the judge's motion.
We have time for 2 more questions.
So I wanted to follow up with the statistics on outmigration. Earlier, the government testified that the figures of, I guess, that had come out from Hunter College seem overly aggressive. Do you have a sense of what outmigration figures might look like or currently look like? And my other question is following up on Mr. Sobrino's comment on lobbying firms. Can you elaborate a little bit? It did seem like your question was poised as, do you know what those firms were contracted to do? It appeared to those there was an implicit criticism as well in hiring them.
It was expressed.
In terms of...
I think Jerry can speak first to the demographics, and then I can talk about that.
Great. In terms of we discussed earlier, the macro assumptions developed in October 10th version of the 7Q liquidity model assume a 15% cumulative population decline over fiscal years 18 and 19. Now we have revised that down from 15% to 10% for fiscal years 18 and 19.
Can you give a sense of what the numbers are and whether there's certain parts of the population, younger, more educated people who seem to be migrating in bigger numbers?
That specific or that deep dive in that number, I don't have it with me right now, but I can, if you give me your card, I will get you that, that information as soon as possible.
And regarding my comments regarding the lobbying firms, Puerto Rico, the government of Puerto Rico can hire lobbyists or can actually engage in certain advocacy efforts, but we are required to post those contracts, establish maximum amounts. They're subject to very clear scrutiny, as has already been seen in the public discussion. And at one point, we did have an issue that the board was contracting separate lobbyists to carry out messages that weren't necessarily aligned with the government's message. And in past weeks, we saw the board testifying before committees in Congress requesting expansion of powers and other measures regarding disaster relief fund. I believe that earlier I heard Ms. Jaresco said that they were no longer requesting those powers. Hopefully, their lobbyists continue to now provide that new message. But we did have an essential disagreement on if those lobbyists were even required or should be hired. And I stated that clearly here.
One last question. If not, all right. Thank you all. Thank you for coming. Thank you.